Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back through the centuries to a world where simply waking up each morning was a genuine accomplishment, where the air itself could kill you, and where humanity teetered on the knife's edge of extinction more times than anyone cares to remember. You're about to wander through the filthy, fascinating, terrifying landscape of medieval Europe, a place where survival was never guaranteed, and death lurked in your bread, your water, your lover's kiss, and the very fleas hopping merrily across your unwashed skin. If you think modern life is stressful, just wait until you're dodging plague carts, drinking from rivers full of tannery runoff, and trusting your medical care to a guy whose other job is cutting hair. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Statistically speaking, most people didn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how this community stretches across time zones, all of us settling in for the night together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1347, and you find yourself standing on the sun-bleached docks of Messina, a bustling Sicilian port town where the smell of salt water mingles with fish guts and the sweat of merchants haggling over silken spices. The Mediterranean sun beats down on your neck as you watch the harbour, busy as always with ships arriving from the great trading centres of the East. Genoa, Venice, Constantinople. These are the arteries through which the lifeblood of medieval commerce flows. You've heard tales from sailors about the exotic lands beyond the horizon, about the wealth of the Silk Road and the mysterious kingdoms of Cathay. What you haven't heard, what nobody here knows yet, is that those same ships carrying precious cargo are also carrying something else, something invisible, something that will, within the next 5 years, kill between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia and North Africa. You notice a galley limping into port, its oars moving sluggishly, erratically. The sailors on the dock around you fall quiet. There's something wrong with this vessel. Even from a distance you can see that the men at the oars are struggling, their movements weak and uncoordinated. As the ship draws closer, the smell hits you. A thick, sweet, rotting stench that makes you gag. The harbour master pushes past you, his face pale, and when the gangplank finally drops, what emerges is the stuff of nightmares. The sailors who stumble off that ship are already dying. Black swellings the size of eggs bulge from their necks, their armpits, their groins. These are the buboes that will give the bubonic plague its name, lymph nodes swollen grotesquely with infection, often bursting and oozing black pus. The men's skin is mottled with dark patches where blood vessels have ruptured beneath the surface. Some are coughing blood, others have already collapsed on the deck, their bodies twisted in the final agonies of death. The Genoese traders who were supposed to deliver precious goods from Caffa, a trading post on the Black Sea, have instead delivered the greatest catastrophe in human history. Historians still argue whether those 12 ships carried rats, fleas, or humans as the primary vectors of initial transmission. What nobody debates is the speed of what happened next. Within days, the disease had spread from the docks into Messina proper. Within weeks, it was racing through Sicily. Within months, it had leapt to the Italian mainland, then France, then Spain, then everywhere. The Sicilian authorities, to their credit, quickly recognised the danger. They ordered the death ships back out to sea, but it was already too late. The fleas had disembarked. The rats had scurried into the grain warehouses. The bacteria Yersinia pestis, that microscopic architect of doom, had found a new continent full of immunologically naive hosts. You try to imagine what it felt like for those first victims, the ones who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. Medieval medicine, such as it was, had no germ theory. Disease was understood through the lens of miasmas, bad air, or divine punishment for sin. When the swellings appeared on your body, when the fever set in and your mind began to cloud, you had two explanations available. Either God was angry, or the alignment of the planets had poisoned the atmosphere. Neither explanation offered much comfort, or, more importantly, any effective treatment. The plague, you see, came in 3 terrifying flavours. Bubonic plague, transmitted by flea bites, gave you those characteristic swellings and killed about 60% of its victims within a week. If you were unlucky enough to contract pneumonic plague, where the bacteria had invaded your lungs, you could spread it simply by breathing, coughing, talking, and your chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. Then there was septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered your bloodstream directly, and death came so quickly that some victims reportedly went to bed healthy and never woke up. You could be laughing at dinner and dead before dessert. The accounts from that first wave of plague are almost too horrifying to read. Boccaccio, the Italian writer who survived the Black Death in Florence, described victims dying so quickly that bodies piled up in houses faster than they could be removed. The sick were abandoned by their own families. Priests refused to administer last rites. Dogs dragged corpses through the streets. The social fabric that held civilization together simply dissolved in the face of such overwhelming terror. People fled cities in panic, carrying the plague with them to previously unaffected villages. Others locked themselves in their homes, hoping to wait out the storm, only to discover that the plague was already inside with them, carried by the rats in their walls or the fleas in their bedding. One of the strangest aspects of the Black Death, something that historians and epidemiologists puzzle over to this day, is the sheer speed of its transmission. Modern bubonic plague, while still deadly, spreads relatively slowly because it relies on flea-to-human contact. But the medieval plague tore through populations with a velocity that suggests something else was happening. Some researchers believe that the pneumonic form was far more prevalent than previously thought, turning the disease into something airborne and terrifyingly contagious. Others point to the peculiar living conditions of medieval Europe. The crowded cities, the complete absence of sanitation, the intimate cohabitation with animals, as a perfect storm of epidemiological vulnerability. You stand on that dock in Messina, watching those dying sailors stumble ashore, and you have absolutely no idea that you're witnessing the opening scene of the apocalypse. Nobody does. The medieval world has no CDC, no World Health Organization, no system for tracking or containing epidemic disease. Information travels at the speed of a horse, which means by the time anyone understands the scope of the disaster, it has already spread beyond any hope of containment. The Byzantine emperor heard about the plague arriving in his realm only after it had been killing his subjects for months. The Pope in Avignon learned of its approach just weeks before it knocked on his own door. And here's the darkest twist in this already dark tale. The Black Death wasn't a one-time event. That initial outbreak from 1347 to 1351 was merely the opening salvo. The plague would return again and again over the following centuries, in waves that killed millions more each time. Some European cities experienced major plague outbreaks every decade for 300 years. The population of Europe, which had reached perhaps 75 million by 1300, wouldn't recover to that level until the 16th century. Entire regions were depopulated. Villages disappeared from the map. So many agricultural workers died that crops rotted in the fields, leading to famines that killed survivors the plague had missed. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Imagine watching a third of everyone you know die within the span of a few years. Imagine watching your children die, your parents die, your spouse die, and being utterly powerless to stop it. Some people turned to extreme religious penance, whipping themselves bloody in the streets, convinced that sufficient suffering would appease an angry God. Others abandoned religion entirely, reasoning that a loving deity would never permit such horrors. Still others embraced wild hedonism, eating, drinking, and fornicating with abandon, figuring they might as well enjoy whatever time remained. The social and economic upheaval was revolutionary. With so many workers dead, those who survived could demand higher wages. Serfdom, that ancient system of bound labour, began to crack as peasants gained leverage they had never possessed before. The old feudal order trembled. In some ways, you could argue that the Black Death planted the seeds that would eventually flower into the Renaissance, into the Reformation, into modernity itself. But that's cold comfort when you're watching your family cough their lungs out. You take one last look at those death ships in Messina harbour, at the sailors being carried away on stretchers that will themselves become contaminated, at the rats scurrying down the mooring ropes into the grain stores of the city. You don't know it yet, but you've just witnessed the moment when medieval Europe's population began its long, agonising collapse, and the docks of Messina are only the beginning of our journey. Because as horrifying as the plague was, it was just one of many ways that medieval people nearly went extinct. The catastrophe brewing beneath their feet, quite literally, was perhaps even more insidious. The ships creak, the rats scurry, the fleas feed, and somewhere in the hold of one of those Genoese galleys, Yersinia pestis is multiplying by the millions, preparing for its great European debut. You leave the docks of Messina behind, but the horror follows you. It follows everyone. And as you make your way through the narrow, winding streets of a typical medieval city, you begin to understand something crucial about why the plague spread so quickly, so relentlessly, so completely. The answer lies beneath your feet. Every step you take across the uneven cobblestones, every puddle you splash through, every drain you pass, all of it conceals a hidden world that medieval people never fully understood. A subterranean kingdom ruled by creatures that would serve as the plague's most effective ambassadors, the rats. You probably think of rats as pests, nuisances that scurry through subway tunnels and rummage through garbage. Annoying, sure, but manageable. Now erase that modern conception from your mind. In medieval Europe, rats weren't just common. They were absolutely everywhere, in numbers that would make a modern exterminator weep with despair. They lived in your walls, nested in your thatch roof, crawled through your grain stores, gnawed through your wooden floors, and shared your bed, whether you knew it or not. The black rat, Rattus rattus, had hitched a ride to Europe centuries earlier, likely travelling along Roman trade routes from Asia, and by the medieval period it had thoroughly colonised every corner of human habitation. Where you went, rats went. Where you stored food, rats feasted. Where you slept, rats bred. The architecture of medieval cities might as well have been designed by rats for rats. Picture the typical urban dwelling. A timber-frame structure with walls packed with straw and mud, a thatched roof providing endless nesting opportunities, a dirt or wooden floor with gaps leading to the earth below, and no barrier whatsoever between the living space and the crawl spaces, attics and cellars where rats made their homes. There was no concept of pest-proof construction, no steel wool stuffed in holes, no concrete foundations, no sealed containers for food storage. Grain was kept in wooden barrels or piled in corners. Meat hung from rafters that rats could easily access. Every medieval home was an all-you-can-eat buffet for the local rodent population. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Medieval cities weren't just rat-friendly on the surface. They had developed an entire infrastructure of rat highways running beneath the streets. The drainage systems, such as they were, consisted of open channels and crude tunnels designed to carry rainwater and waste away from buildings. These channels connected cellars to cellars, buildings to buildings, neighbourhoods to neighbourhoods. A rat could travel from one end of a medieval city to the other without ever seeing daylight, following this underground network of passages that humans had inadvertently constructed for their convenience. When plague-infected fleas dropped off dying rats, they didn't have far to travel to find new hosts. The next rat was never more than a few feet away. You duck into a tavern to escape the afternoon sun, and immediately you're sharing space with more rats than you'll ever see. They're in the walls right now, listening to the murmur of conversation, waiting for night to fall so they can emerge and clean up the crumbs from the rushes scattered across the floor. The rushes themselves, that layer of dried reeds and herbs that covers virtually every medieval floor, are a rat paradise. Spilled food gets trampled into the rushes and left there for weeks or months, providing a steady food source. Fleas thrive in the warm, moist environment beneath the rushes, hopping from rat to human and back again. When you finally lie down to sleep tonight, you'll be resting on a flea incubator. Historians still argue whether the black rat alone was responsible for plague transmission, or whether other rodent species played significant roles. Some researchers have pointed out that in certain regions, plague spread faster than rat populations could plausibly have carried it, suggesting that human-to-human transmission via fleas or lice might have been more important than traditionally believed. Others note that the brown rat, which would eventually displace the black rat in much of Europe, hadn't yet arrived during the initial Black Death outbreak. The black rat, unlike its brown cousin, is an excellent climber and prefers to live in close proximity to humans, making it the perfect plague vector. It nested in your roof, travelled through your walls, and died in your living space, depositing hungry, infected fleas wherever it went. The flea itself deserves a moment of horrified appreciation. The rat flea, Xenophila sciopus, is a marvel of disgusting evolution. When it feeds on a plague-infected rat, the Yersinia pestis bacteria multiply in its gut, eventually forming a blockage that prevents the flea from properly digesting blood. The flea becomes desperately hungry, biting more frequently and more aggressively, but it can't actually feed. Instead, when it bites, it regurgitates bacteria-laden blood back into the wound. The sicker the flea gets, The more frantically it bites, the more plague it spreads. When its rat host dies, the flea hops off the cooling body and searches for the nearest warm-blooded alternative. In a medieval home, that alternative was often human. You scratch absently at your ankle. Everyone scratches in the medieval world. Flea bites are so common that they barely register as notable. The small, itchy welts that dot your legs and arms are simply part of life, like the smell of the street or the taste of stale bread. You have no idea that each of those bites is a potential death sentence, a tiny puncture through which apocalypse might enter your bloodstream. The merchant sitting across from you scratches his neck. The serving girl scratches her wrist. The innkeeper scratches everywhere. You're all hosting fleas, trading them back and forth with every brush of contact, every shared seat, every exchanged coin. The rural areas weren't much better, despite what you might assume about the supposedly cleaner countryside. Peasant cottages were often shared with livestock, chickens, pigs, sometimes even cows, providing ample opportunities for rats to thrive alongside other animals. Grain storage attracted rats from miles around. The lack of stone construction meant that rats could gnaw their way into any building they desired. And the agricultural workers who did most of the actual dying during plague outbreaks lived in conditions that would shock a modern health inspector into cardiac arrest. Packed earth floors, shared sleeping spaces, no ventilation, no sanitation, no hope. One of the most darkly comic aspects of medieval rat management was the legal system's occasional attempts to address the problem through litigation. Yes, you read that correctly. In several documented cases, ecclesiastical courts actually put rats on trial for their crimes against humanity. The rats were formally summoned to appear, given legal representation, and prosecuted for destroying crops or spreading disease. When the rats failed to appear in court, shocking, I know, their attorneys would argue for leniency on grounds that the journey was too dangerous, or that the summons hadn't been properly delivered. The courts sometimes ruled in the rats' favour, or excommunicated them, or ordered them to leave the jurisdiction within a specified time period. The rats, regrettably, did not comply with these legal judgments. Beyond the courts, medieval people tried countless methods to control rat populations, all of them woefully inadequate. They kept cats, though never enough of them, and often with superstitious suspicion we'll discuss later. They set traps, basic spring-loaded devices that might catch a few rats but couldn't make a dent in populations numbering in the millions. They employed rat catchers, specialists who made a living hunting rats in cellars and sewers, but even the most skilled rat catcher was fighting an impossible battle. Some towns tried offering bounties for rat tails, only to discover that enterprising citizens were breeding rats to collect the reward. The rats always won. The granaries were the worst hot zones. Every medieval city maintained stores of grain to protect against famine, and these granaries were rat paradises. Massive wooden structures filled with thousands of bushels of wheat, barley and rye, protected by nothing more than wooden walls that a determined rat could chew through in minutes. The rats didn't just eat the grain. They contaminated it with their droppings, their urine, their corpses. When plague struck, these granaries became death factories, sending infected grain and infected rats out to every bakery, every household, every mouth in the city. You finish your ale and step back into the street, where the afternoon shadows are lengthening and the rats are starting to stir in their hidden warrens. Tonight, while you sleep, they'll emerge by the thousands, flowing through the city like a dark tide, visiting every home, every shop, every church. They'll feed on your scraps, drink from your water barrels, and leave behind a trail of flea-infested droppings. Some of them are already sick, their blood teeming with bacteria, their fleas growing hungrier by the hour. The infrastructure of death is all around you, invisible but inescapable. The rat highways beneath your feet connect every building in the city into a single epidemiological unit. When plague arrives, it won't knock politely at individual doors. It will flood through the system all at once, reaching everywhere simultaneously. The sun sets on the medieval city, and in the darkness the rats begin to move. You can hear them now if you listen carefully. The scratch of claws on wood, the squeak of communication, the soft thump of bodies dropping from rafters to floor. They're not afraid of you. Why would they be? They outnumber you 100 to 1, and they've been here longer than your civilization. The medieval world belongs to them as much as it belongs to you, perhaps more. You just don't know it yet. But the rats and their fleas were merely the delivery system. The true killer needed vulnerable hosts, and medieval Europe was about to provide them in abundance. Because as you're about to discover, the climate itself was turning against humanity, and starvation would weaken an entire continent just in time for the plague to arrive. The cold comes slowly at first. You barely notice it during the early years of the 14th century, just a slight chill that lingers a bit longer into spring, a harvest that comes a week or two later than your grandfather remembers. The old farmers shake their heads and mutter about strange weather, but strange weather happens sometimes. Nothing to worry about. Except the cold keeps coming. The summers grow shorter, the winters grow longer, the rains come at the wrong times, drowning crops in the field or failing to appear when seeds desperately need moisture. And then, in the spring of 1315, the skies open up and simply refuse to close, and you realise that something has gone terribly catastrophically wrong with the world. You wake one morning in that fateful year to the sound of rain hammering against your roof, and when you step outside, you see your carefully planted fields transformed into shallow lakes. The water stands ankle-deep between the furrows, and the young grain shoots that should be pushing toward the sun are instead rotting where they stand, their roots drowning in soil that has become more mud than earth. You tell yourself it will stop soon. Spring rains are normal, but the rain doesn't stop. It falls through April, through May, through June. It falls so relentlessly that the chroniclers of the time describe it as a new deluge, a second flood sent by God to punish a sinful world. The grain rots, the hay rots, the vegetables rot, and when autumn finally arrives, there is almost nothing to harvest. This is the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, one of the worst demographic catastrophes in European history, and you're living through it with no understanding of why it's happening or when it might end. The Little Ice Age, as modern climatologists call it, was a period of global cooling that would last for centuries, but its opening act was this 7-year nightmare of failed harvests, mass starvation, and social collapse. The medieval warm period that had allowed European population to boom during the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries was over. The climate had shifted, and humanity was utterly unprepared. The first winter is bad. The grain stores, already depleted by the failed harvest, run out months before the next growing season. Bread prices triple, then quadruple, then rise so high that ordinary people simply cannot afford to eat. You watch your neighbours grow thin, then gaunt, then skeletal. The children are the first to show the signs of starvation. Distended bellies, hollow eyes, hair falling out in patches. The elderly follow close behind. The strong and healthy hold on longer, but even they begin to weaken as the months drag on, and the rain keeps falling. By the time spring arrives again, bringing more floods and more failed crops, entire villages are dying. Historians still argue whether the Great Famine killed 10% of Northern Europe's population, or closer to 25%. The chroniclers of the time were not statisticians, and their accounts tend toward the impressionistic rather than the precise. But what they describe is unambiguous in its horror. Cities that had been bustling centres of trade became ghost towns. Roads that had carried merchants and pilgrims became lined with corpses. Parents abandoned children they could no longer feed. Children abandoned parents who had become too weak to travel. The social bonds that held medieval society together frayed and snapped under the pressure of survival. You hear rumours from the countryside that make your blood run cold. Stories of families eating their dead. Stories of travellers who disappear, their bodies found later with suspicious marks. Stories of children sold to strangers for a handful of grain, their fates never discovered. These are not mere rumours, though you desperately want to believe they are. The Chronicle of the Abbey of Saint-Martin-in-Tournai records matter-of-factly that parents ate their children, and children ate their parents during the famine years. Similar accounts appear in sources from Ireland to Poland. When starvation reaches a certain point, the taboos that define humanity begin to dissolve. You try not to think about what you might do if it came to that. You try not to think about how close you already are. The livestock die alongside the humans. The rains that drown the grain also flood the pastures, and the cattle and sheep that survive the flooding often succumb to disease in the wet, cold conditions. A murrain sweeps through the animal populations of Europe, killing perhaps 80% of the cattle in some regions. The oxen that pull your plough die. The cows that provide milk and cheese die. The sheep that give wool for clothing die. Suddenly there is no meat, no dairy, no leather for shoes, no wool for cloaks. The cascade of agricultural collapse touches every aspect of medieval life, leaving nothing untouched. Salt becomes worth its weight in silver. Without salt, you cannot preserve food for the lean months. Without preserved food, you cannot survive the winter. The salt mines and salt pans that normally supply northern Europe struggle to meet demand as desperate people hoard whatever they can find. Fish, which had been a staple protein source, becomes difficult to salt and preserve, meaning it must be eaten fresh or not at all. The complex supply chains that kept medieval cities fed begin to break down as each region turns inward, hoarding whatever resources it can for its own survival. The desperation drives innovations that would be comic if they weren't so tragic. People try eating grass, bark, leaves, roots, anything that seems remotely edible. They grind acorns into bitter flour. They boil leather scraps to extract whatever nutrition might remain. They catch rats and mice and roast them over fires made from furniture because the forests have been stripped bare by people seeking food and fuel. Some reportedly eat clay or dirt, their starving bodies craving minerals even as the indigestible material tears their intestines apart. The chronicles describe bodies found with green-stained mouths, their last meal a handful of grass that their systems could not process. The cities are hit especially hard because cities cannot feed themselves. Medieval urban centres depended entirely on the countryside for food, and when the countryside had nothing to give, the cities starved. London, Paris, Bruges, Florence, all the great metropolises of Europe saw their populations decimated as food supplies dried up, and prices rose beyond any reasonable measure. The poor died first, of course, but even the wealthy struggled to find food at any price. Merchants who had grown fat on the profits of trade found themselves bidding against each other for a single sack of musty grain. The King of England himself faced supply shortages that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The weather continues its assault through 1316, 1317, 1318. Each year brings hope that this will be the season when the rains stop and the harvest return, and each year that hope is crushed under grey skies and endless precipitation. You've forgotten what a normal summer feels like. Your children, born during the famine years, have never known one. The stunted, malnourished generation growing up during this period will carry the marks of their deprivation for life. Shorter stature, weaker bones, compromised immune systems. They are being shaped by hunger into something more vulnerable, more fragile, more susceptible to whatever comes next. Crime explodes across Europe as social order collapses. Hungry people do not remain law-abiding people, and the famine years see banditry reach epidemic proportions. Travellers are robbed and sometimes killed for whatever food they carry. Granaries and storehouses are broken into by mobs too desperate to fear punishment. The authorities, themselves weakened by the crisis, struggle to maintain control. In some regions, vigilante justice replaces official law as communities take matters into their own hands. The chronicles record public executions of food hoarders, of thieves, of anyone suspected of making the crisis worse through greed or criminality. The church offers spiritual comfort but little practical assistance. Prayers for good weather go unanswered. Processions and fasts do nothing to stop the rain. The clergy themselves are hungry, their monasteries and parishes struggling alongside everyone else. Some begin to question whether God has abandoned his people, whether the famine is punishment for sins too great to be forgiven. Others double down on piety, convinced that insufficient devotion is the cause of their suffering. The flagellant movements that will later accompany the Black Death have their roots in these years of desperate, hungry faith. By 1322 the rains finally ease and something like normal harvests return. But normal is no longer what it was. Millions are dead. Entire villages have been abandoned. The agricultural infrastructure that had supported a growing population lies in ruins. Livestock gone, seed grain eaten, fields neglected for years. The recovery will take decades. And here's the crucial thing you need to understand as you stumble through these starving years. The famine doesn't just kill people directly. It weakens the survivors. It compromises their immune systems, their nutritional reserves, their ability to fight off disease. When the Black Death arrives a generation later, it will find a population already debilitated by years of hunger, already primed for catastrophe. You survived the Great Famine, let's say. Many didn't, but you did. You emerge from those 7 years thinner, weaker, older than your years. The memory of that hunger never leaves you. Neither does the memory of what you saw people do when the hunger became unbearable. But at least the worst is over, you tell yourself. At least the skies have cleared and the grain is growing again. You have no way of knowing that the climate shift which caused the famine is just beginning, that the Little Ice Age will persist for centuries, that your grandchildren will face hardships you cannot imagine. And you certainly have no way of knowing that the famine was merely the opening act, that something far worse is breeding in the grain stores where the rats have been feeding, waiting for weakened bodies to consume. The survivors eat their first full meals in years and feel something like hope. The rats eat alongside them, growing fat and numerous once more, and the fleas feed on the rats, patient and hungry, waiting. You've survived the famine, you've buried the dead, mourned the lost, and slowly rebuilt something like a normal life. The granaries are filling again, the cattle are multiplying, and bread no longer costs more than a peasant earns in a month. But now something strange is happening in your village, something that defies explanation. People are dancing in the streets, not joyfully, not in celebration. They're dancing because they cannot stop. Their faces are contorted in agony, their bodies jerking and twisting in movements that no sane person would choose to make. They scream for help even as their legs keep moving, keep stamping, keep carrying them in endless, exhausting circles. Some have been dancing for days, some are dancing themselves to death. Welcome to one of the most bizarre and terrifying phenomena of medieval Europe, the dancing plagues. You stand at the edge of the town square, watching in horrified fascination as dozens of your neighbours writhe and gyrate in a grotesque parody of celebration. Their shoes have worn through, their feet are bleeding, some have collapsed and lie twitching on the ground, their bodies still attempting the motions of dance even as exhaustion claims them. Others keep going, their eyes wild with a terror that suggests they are fully aware of what's happening but utterly powerless to stop it. The musicians you see playing frantically at the edge of the crowd aren't there to encourage the dancing. They're there because someone decided that if the afflicted could dance faster, they might dance the madness out of their systems. It doesn't seem to be working. The most famous outbreak occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. She danced for days without rest, without food, without water. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. Within a month, the number had swelled to 400. The city authorities, completely baffled by what they were witnessing, initially tried to cure the affliction by encouraging more dancing. They hired musicians, opened guild halls for the dancers to use, and even constructed a wooden stage. When this predictably failed to help, they reversed course and banned public dancing and music entirely, then carted the afflicted off to a mountaintop shrine to pray for divine intervention. The outbreak eventually subsided, but not before dozens had died from exhaustion, stroke, and heart attack. Historians still argue whether the dancing plagues were mass psychogenic illness, ergot poisoning, or something else entirely. The psychogenic explanation suggests that the dancing was a form of mass hysteria, a psychological contagion that spread through communities already traumatized by famine, plague, and endless hardship. Under this theory, the dancers weren't physically compelled to move. Their minds had simply broken under stress in a way that manifested as involuntary motion. The medieval world was not kind to mental health, and the accumulated trauma of the 14th and 15th centuries might well have produced widespread psychological collapse. But there's another explanation that points to something you've been eating without knowing it could kill you. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet, cold conditions, exactly the conditions that prevailed during the Little Ice Age. When you eat bread made from ergot-contaminated grain, you ingest a cocktail of psychoactive compounds that are chemically related to LSD. The effects can include hallucinations, convulsions, a burning sensation in the limbs, and uncontrollable muscle spasms. In severe cases, ergot poisoning causes gangrene of the extremities as blood vessels constrict and tissue dies. Medieval people called this affliction St. Anthony's Fire, after the religious order that specialised in treating its victims, and outbreaks were recorded throughout the medieval period. You think back to the bread you ate this morning, the dark rye loaf that forms the staple of your diet. Did it taste strange? Was the flour a slightly odd colour? Would you even know if it was contaminated? Ergot-infected grain often looks different. The fungal bodies that replace the grain kernels are dark and elongated, but tired, hungry millers working in dim light might easily miss the signs. Even if they noticed, would they throw away precious grain during times of scarcity? The economics of survival often trumped the risks of contamination. You ate what you had or you didn't eat at all. The connection between ergot and the dancing plagues remains controversial. Some researchers point out that ergot poisoning typically causes lethargy and weakness, rather than frantic activity, making it an unlikely candidate for the dancing outbreaks. Others argue that the psychoactive effects could vary depending on the specific alkaloids present and the dose consumed. The truth is that we may never know exactly what caused those terrified people to dance until they dropped. What we do know is that contaminated grain was a constant threat to medieval populations, one that killed and maimed in ways that seemed utterly inexplicable to those who suffered. Beyond the dancing plagues, ergot poisoning manifested in other horrifying ways. St. Anthony's fire was named for the burning pain that sufferers felt in their extremities as the ergot alkaloids constricted blood flow. The sensation was described as feeling like flames consuming the flesh from within. In advanced cases, fingers, toes, hands and feet would literally rot and fall off as gangrene set in. Medieval hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony treated thousands of ergotism victims, some of whom had lost multiple limbs to the disease. The brothers developed a treatment regimen that included a special diet free of contaminated grain, which often led to recovery, not because of any divine intervention, but because removing the source of poisoning allowed the body to heal. The mental effects of ergot could be equally devastating. People reported terrifying hallucinations, sensations of insects crawling beneath their skin, overwhelming paranoia, and complete breaks with reality. In an age when mental illness was often attributed to demonic possession, ergotism victims might find themselves subject to exorcism, imprisonment, or worse. The line between poisoning and possession was invisible to medieval observers, and the treatments for one were dramatically different from the treatments for the other. Many ergotism sufferers likely died at the hands of well-meaning priests attempting to drive out demons that existed only in their chemically altered brains. You wander away from the dancing crowd, your mind reeling from what you've witnessed. The dancers' screams follow you down the street, a soundtrack of suffering that you won't soon forget. How many of them will survive? How many will dance until their hearts give out or their bodies simply collapse from dehydration? The authorities seem as confused as everyone else, torn between treating this as a medical crisis, a spiritual affliction, or perhaps some strange new form of entertainment. Nobody mentions the grain. Nobody thinks to check the flour for signs of contamination. Why would they? The connection between mouldy bread and madness is centuries away from being understood. The strangest aspect of the dancing plagues is how they spread from person to person. Whatever the initial cause, psychological, chemical, or something else, the affliction seemed to be contagious in a way that defies easy explanation. People who witnessed the dancing sometimes joined in involuntarily, as if the mere sight of the writhing bodies triggered something in their own neurology. This suggests a strong psychogenic component, a kind of psychological virus that transmitted through observation and social connection. The medieval world was tightly knit, communities bound together by shared work, shared worship, shared suffering. When one person broke, others might easily follow. Similar mass psychogenic events have occurred throughout history and continue to occur today. Schools have experienced outbreaks of fainting, twitching, and other symptoms that spread rapidly through student populations before disappearing just as mysteriously. The mechanism seems to involve a combination of stress, close social bonds, and the human tendency to unconsciously mirror the behaviours of those around us. Medieval Europe, with its constant background radiation of fear and uncertainty, its tight-knit villages and guilds, its shared trauma of famine and plague, was a perfect breeding ground for such contagions of the mind. The dancing plagues gradually faded from European history after the 16th century, though no one is entirely sure why. Perhaps the end of the most severe phase of the Little Ice Age reduced ergot contamination. Perhaps changing social structures made mass psychological contagion less likely. Perhaps the Reformation and the scientific revolution gradually altered how people processed and expressed collective stress. Or perhaps we simply stopped recording such events with the same horrified fascination, allowing them to slip from historical memory into mere local legend. You make it home as darkness falls, your mind still churning with images of those tortured dancers. You look at the bread on your table with new suspicion. Is it safe? How would you know? The grain came from the mill, and the miller got it from farmers across the region. Any of them might have harvested contaminated rye without knowing it. You break off a piece and chew slowly, trying to detect any unusual taste, any hint that this loaf might be your last. It tastes like bread. Just bread. You swallow and hope for the best. That night you dream of dancing. Your legs move without your permission, carrying you in circles through a landscape of fever and shadow. You try to stop, but your body won't obey. The music plays on somewhere in the darkness, and your feet keep time to a rhythm you never chose to follow. When you wake, sweating, you find that your legs are twitching beneath the blankets, still keeping time to music only they can hear. You lie very still and wait for the dawn, wondering if this is how it begins. The sun rises and your legs have stopped twitching. You're not going to dance yourself to death today, it seems. Small victories. But as you stretch and prepare for another day of medieval existence, a new terror awaits, one that doesn't come from contaminated bread or invisible pestilence, but from the people who are supposedly trying to help you. Because sooner or later in this world, you're going to get injured, you're going to get sick, and when that happens, you're going to need medical care. The problem is that medieval medical care is almost certainly going to kill you faster than whatever ailed you in the first place. You've cut your arm working in the field. It's not a terrible wound, just a deep gash from a scythe that slipped at the wrong moment. In the modern world, you'd clean it, apply some antibiotic ointment, bandage it up, and go about your day. In the medieval world, this cut might kill you, not because the wound itself is life-threatening, but because of what happens next. You visit the local barber surgeon, a cheerful fellow whose primary profession is cutting hair, but who also handles medical procedures on the side. He takes one look at your wound, nods sagely, and reaches for a pot of boiling oil. The application of boiling oil to wounds was standard practice for centuries, based on the theory that gunpowder and other contaminants were poisonous and needed to be burned out of the flesh. Never mind that your injury came from a farming implement rather than a firearm, the treatment remains the same. The barber surgeon pours the scalding liquid directly into your wound, and you scream with a pain that makes the original injury feel like a gentle caress. The oil sears your flesh, destroying tissue, creating new damage far worse than what you came in with. When the torture finally ends, the barber surgeon bandages your arm with a cloth that has been used on dozens of previous patients without ever being washed. The bandage is stiff with dried blood and pus from wounds past. You pay him for his services and stumble home, your arm now far more likely to become infected than if you'd simply left it alone. The concept of antiseptic practice doesn't exist yet. It won't exist for centuries. The germ theory of disease is so far in the future that suggesting it would mark you as a lunatic. Medieval medicine operates on entirely different principles, most of them derived from the ancient Greek physician Galen, who died over 1,000 years before your time, but whose ideas still dominate medical practice. Galen taught that the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from an imbalance among these substances. Treatment therefore focused on restoring balance, typically through bloodletting, purging, or the application of substances designed to draw out or counteract the offending humour. You're feeling weak from the wound and the treatment, so the barber surgeon recommends bloodletting to help restore your humoral balance. He produces a lancet, a small sharp blade that has never been sterilised because sterilisation is not a concept anyone has invented, and makes an incision in your other arm. Blood flows into a bowl while you grow progressively weaker. The theory holds that removing blood will allow your body to generate fresh, healthy blood to replace it, bringing your humours back into equilibrium. The reality is that you're losing vital fluid at a time when your body desperately needs it to fight infection and heal tissue. But the barber surgeon seems confident, and who are you to argue with centuries of medical tradition? Historians still argue whether medieval medicine did more harm than good overall, but the consensus tends toward harm. The treatments were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to cure, bloodletting weakened patients fighting infection, purging through induced vomiting or diarrhea dehydrated already sick bodies. The compounds used as medicines frequently contained toxic substances that poisoned patients slowly even as they were supposedly healing them. Mercury was used to treat syphilis and skin conditions. Arsenic appeared in various remedies. Lead compounds served as everything from cosmetics to pain relievers. Medieval pharmacopoeia was a catalogue of poisons administered with the best of intentions. Battlefield medicine was particularly horrifying. Picture yourself as a soldier wounded in one of the countless wars that ravaged medieval Europe. An arrow has pierced your thigh, missing the artery but embedding deep in the muscle. In a modern field hospital, this would be a serious but survivable wound. In a medieval army camp, your odds are considerably grimmer. The surgeon, if one is even available, will attempt to extract the arrow, likely enlarging the wound significantly in the process. He'll then cauterize the bleeding vessels with a red-hot iron or boiling oil. The pain is indescribable, and you receive no anesthesia because reliable anesthesia doesn't exist. Some surgeons offer a leather strap to bite on. Some offer strong wine. Some offer nothing at all but instructions to hold still. If the wound becomes infected, and it almost certainly will given the complete absence of sterile technique, the surgeon's options are limited. He might try to drain the infection by lancing the wound, releasing a flood of foul-smelling pus. He might apply poultices of various substances believed to draw out corruption: honey, mouldy bread, animal dung, crushed herbs. Some of these treatments accidentally worked. Honey does have antimicrobial properties, and mouldy bread sometimes contains natural antibiotics, but the successes were random rather than understood. For every soldier saved by a folk remedy that happened to contain helpful compounds, dozens more died from treatments that introduced new infections or actively poisoned their weakened systems. Amputation was the final resort, and it was ghastly beyond imagining. The surgeon would tie a tourniquet above the damaged limb, then saw through flesh and bone while assistants held the screaming patient immobile. Speed was essential because there was no way to control pain or prevent shock. The best surgeons could remove a leg in under a minute, a grim skill honed through practice on countless unfortunate souls. After the amputation, the stump would be cauterized or dipped in boiling pitch to stop the bleeding. Survival rates were abysmal. Between blood loss, shock, and infection, more than half of all amputation patients died. Those who survived often succumbed weeks later to gangrene or sepsis. The medieval hospital was less a place of healing and more a place of dying with company. Most hospitals were run by religious orders and focused more on spiritual care than medical treatment. You might receive prayers, last rites, and a clean bed, but actual medical intervention was minimal. This was perhaps fortunate, given how dangerous such intervention tended to be. The hospitals that did offer more active treatment often became vectors for disease transmission, crowding sick patients together in conditions that allowed infections to spread freely. If you entered a medieval hospital with a minor illness, you stood a reasonable chance of leaving with a major one, assuming you left at all. Women face particular dangers in childbirth, which we'll explore more fully later, but the general principles of medieval obstetrics were as harmful as the rest of medical practice. Midwives and physicians alike operated with no understanding of hygiene, frequently examining labouring women with unwashed hands that carried deadly bacteria. Complications that could be managed with modern surgical techniques were instead left to resolve themselves or to kill mother, child, or both. The interventions that were attempted, forceps deliveries, manual extraction of stuck infants, caesarean sections performed only on dying women, often caused more damage than they prevented. Mental illness was treated with approaches that range from benign neglect to active torture. The possessed, as those with psychological disorders were often labelled, might be prayed over, exorcised, beaten, starved, or locked in chains. Conditions like epilepsy, schizophrenia, and severe depression were interpreted through religious frameworks that saw demons and divine punishment, rather than neurological or psychological dysfunction. The treatments aimed to drive out evil spirits rather than address underlying causes, and they frequently made already suffering patients suffer immeasurably more. You sit in your cottage nursing your twice-wounded arm and contemplate the medical landscape of your world. The barber surgeon meant well. They all mean well, but meaning well and doing good are entirely different things, and the gap between medieval medical theory and actual physiological reality is vast enough to swallow millions of lives. Every treatment you might receive carries risks that outweigh its benefits. Every healer you might consult operates on principles that are fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Your best strategy for surviving illness or injury is often to avoid medical care entirely, trusting your body's natural healing abilities rather than the tender ministrations of professionals who will almost certainly make things worse. The infection sets in 3 days later. Your arm swells and reddens, hot to the touch, pulsing with a pain that keeps you awake at night. The barber surgeon visits again and pronounces the wound humours imbalanced, recommending more bloodletting and a poultice of sheep dung mixed with honey. You lie on your straw mattress, fever climbing, and wonder if this is how your story ends, not with plague or famine or dancing, but with a simple cut gone wrong and treatments that turned a manageable wound into a death sentence. The night passes slowly. You drift between consciousness and delirium, your body fighting a battle that medieval medicine has made infinitely harder to win. By some miracle, you survive. Your immune system, evolved over millions of years to combat exactly these kinds of bacterial invaders, manages to overcome both the infection and the treatments. You're weak for weeks afterward, and your arm never fully regains its strength, but you're alive. You've beaten the odds. You've survived medieval medicine. But as you recover, you notice a new blemish on your face, a small mark that wasn't there before. Perhaps you should see someone about it. Perhaps a little mercury ointment would clear it right up. That blemish on your face concerns you. It's small, just a slight discoloration, but in a world without mirrors in every room, you rely on the reactions of others to gauge your appearance. People have started to look at you strangely. Your spouse mentions that your complexion seems off. The local wise woman suggests you visit the apothecary in the nearest town for something to clear your skin. And so, with a few coins in your pocket and hope in your heart, you set off to purchase the miracle cosmetics and medicines that medieval commerce has to offer. You have no idea that you're about to poison yourself. The apothecary's shop is a wonder of colourful jars and mysterious powders, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling and strange liquids bubbling in glass vessels. The apothecary himself is a learned man, or at least presents himself as such, and he listens to your concerns with professional sympathy. For your complexion, he recommends a white lead paste called ceruse, guaranteed to give you the pale, luminous skin that fashion demands. For any digestive troubles, he offers a mercury-based purgative that will clean your system thoroughly. For aches and pains, he has a lovely arsenic compound that numbs discomfort wonderfully. You purchase all three, feeling fortunate to have access to such sophisticated remedies. You've just bought a slow, agonizing death in convenient take-home packaging. Lead poisoning was endemic to medieval Europe, though nobody called it that or understood its cause. The Romans had used lead extensively, in pipes, in cookware, in wine sweeteners, and medieval society inherited both the infrastructure and the habits. But the cosmetic use of lead was perhaps the most insidious exposure route, because it involved deliberately applying toxic metal directly to the skin, day after day, year after year. Ceruse, that white lead paste, was the foundation of fashionable beauty for centuries. Women and men of status slathered it on their faces to achieve the pale complexion that signified wealth and indoor living. The whiter your face, the less you looked like a sunburned peasant who laboured in fields. The whiter your face, the more you looked like you were dying of lead poisoning, which, conveniently, you were. The symptoms came on gradually, which made the connection almost impossible to recognise. Your hands developed a slight tremor. Your gums began to ache and bleed. You felt tired all the time, sluggish, unable to concentrate. Your stomach cramped unpredictably. Your mood swung wildly between irritability and depression. You might have attributed any of these symptoms to a dozen other causes: bad humours, spiritual affliction, simple aging, but never to the white paste you applied so carefully each morning. The lead accumulated in your bones, your organs, your brain, building up over years of faithful use until the damage became impossible to ignore. By then, it was far too late. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning contributed to the fall of Rome, with some suggesting that endemic lead exposure weakened the population and impaired the judgment of leaders over generations. The medieval period saw no reduction in lead use, and possibly an increase as mining and metallurgy expanded. The wealthy, who could afford the finest cosmetics and the most elaborate plumbing, often suffered the most severe exposure. The poor, lacking access to such luxuries, ironically avoided some of the worst poisoning. Your social aspirations, your desire to look beautiful and successful, were literally killing you one application at a time. Mercury was even more immediately destructive. The silvery liquid metal fascinated medieval alchemists and physicians alike, and its various compounds found their way into treatments for almost everything. Syphilis, which arrived in Europe in the late 15th century and spread with terrifying speed, was treated primarily with mercury, applied to the skin, ingested as pills, or inhaled as vapour in special heated chambers. The treatment was so strongly associated with the disease that a common saying held, it was better to spend one night with Venus than a lifetime with Mercury. The mercury did kill the syphilis bacteria, or at least slow its progression, but it also destroyed the patient from the inside out. Mercury poisoning produces a distinctive constellation of symptoms that medieval physicians interpreted as signs of healing rather than harm. Your gums swelled and your teeth loosened, falling out one by one. Your saliva production increased dramatically, causing constant drooling that was seen as the body expelling disease. Your hands trembled uncontrollably, the origin of the phrase "mad as a hatter," since hat makers who used mercury in their craft often developed neurological damage. Your personality changed as the metal accumulated in your brain, producing irritability, paranoia, hallucinations, and eventually dementia. Patients undergoing mercury treatment for syphilis often suffered more from the cure than from the disease, trading a chronic infection for acute metal poisoning. You take your new mercury purgative as directed, mixing the prescribed amount into water and drinking it down. The effect is immediate and violent. Your bowels empty themselves with explosive force, and you spend the next several hours in intimate communion with the latrine. The apothecary assured you this was normal, even desirable. The purging indicates the medicine is working, driving corrupt humours from your system. What's actually happening is that your body is desperately trying to expel a toxic substance, and in the process, you're losing fluids and electrolytes that your system needs. You emerge from the experience weaker than before, slightly poisoned, and convinced that you've done yourself a tremendous favour. Arsenic occupied a peculiar place in medieval medicine and society. On one hand, it was a known poison, the weapon of choice for assassins and ambitious relatives throughout history. On the other hand, small doses were believed to have therapeutic effects, and arsenic compounds appeared in treatments for everything from skin conditions to respiratory problems. The line between medicinal dose and lethal dose was terrifyingly thin, and apothecaries working without standardized measurements or quality control could easily err on the wrong side. You might visit the apothecary for a cough remedy and receive a dose that stopped your coughing permanently by stopping your heartbeat. The cosmetic use of arsenic was particularly popular among those seeking clear, pale skin. Arsenic compounds could indeed produce a temporary improvement in complexion by killing the skin's outer layers and promoting the growth of new cells beneath. The effect was not unlike a chemical peel, except that the chemical in question was accumulating in your organs with each application. Women who used arsenic-based beautifiers often developed the characteristic signs of chronic poisoning: peripheral neuropathy causing numbness and tingling in the extremities, gastrointestinal disturbances, and eventually kidney and liver failure. They died beautiful, or at least pale, which in medieval aesthetics amounted to the same thing. The wealthy suffered disproportionately from cosmetic poisoning because they had the resources to poison themselves more thoroughly. Queens and noblewomen maintained elaborate beauty regimens that included daily applications of lead, mercury, and arsenic compounds. Elizabeth I of England, though technically just past the medieval period, exemplified the phenomenon perfectly. Her famous white face was achieved through ceruse, and her declining health in later years showed all the hallmarks of chronic lead toxicity. The portraits from her final years show a woman whose cosmetics had become a prison, each layer of white paste necessary to cover the damage done by the previous applications. Common people weren't immune to toxic exposure, though their routes of poisoning were often different. Lead glazes on pottery leached into food and drink. Mercury from mining operations contaminated water supplies. Arsenic occurred naturally in some wells. The urban environment itself became increasingly toxic as medieval cities grew and industrial processes multiplied. Tanneries used chrome and other heavy metals. Dyers worked with mordants containing lead and arsenic. Metal workers breathed fumes of every description. The air, the water, the food, the very products you use to maintain your home and your body, all carried invisible poisons that accumulated year by year. You return home from the apothecary with your purchases, feeling optimistic about your health prospects. The white lead paste makes your skin luminously pale, hiding not just the original blemish, but every imperfection. Your spouse compliments your appearance. Your neighbours treat you with new respect, seeing in your refined complexion the mark of someone who cares for themselves properly. You have no idea that the tremor in your hands is worsening slightly each month, that the headaches you've been experiencing are caused by the very cosmetics that make you look so healthy, that the medicine you take for your stomach is destroying your kidneys even as it provides temporary relief. The truly insidious thing about chronic poisoning is how it masquerades as other ailments. When your symptoms worsen, you don't conclude that your remedies are killing you. You conclude that you need more remedies. The apothecary is happy to oblige, selling you increasingly potent preparations to address symptoms caused by his previous preparations. It's a cycle that enriches the medical establishment while slowly destroying its patients, and nobody involved has any idea what's happening. The apothecary believes in his products. You believe in his expertise. The lead, mercury and arsenic, believe in nothing but follow their chemistry inexorably toward your organs. You look at yourself in a polished metal disc that serves as a mirror, and you see a successful person staring back. Pale, refined, a little tired perhaps, but fundamentally well. The face in the mirror doesn't reveal the heavy metals circulating through your bloodstream, depositing in your bones, accumulating in your brain. It doesn't show the future, the tremors, the confusion, the slow decline that awaits. It shows only the present, and in the present you look wonderful. You apply another layer of ceruse, smoothing it carefully across your cheeks, and prepare to face another day in the medieval world, never suspecting that the face you're so carefully maintaining is slowly becoming your death mask. Your pale, lead-painted face has earned you a certain status in your community, but now duty calls you far from home. The year is 1190, give or take, and word has reached your village that Christendom is mustering another great expedition to the Holy Land. The Saracens hold Jerusalem, the holiest city in the Christian world, and the Pope himself has called all able-bodied men to take up the cross and reclaim it for the faith. You're swept up in the fervour that grips your community, inspired by fiery sermons and the promise of spiritual rewards beyond measure. Your sins will be forgiven, the priests tell you. Your place in heaven will be assured. All you have to do is march a few thousand miles to a foreign land, fight an entrenched enemy in unfamiliar terrain, and somehow survive long enough to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Simple enough. You sew a red cross onto your tunic and join the stream of crusaders heading east. The journey itself is an education in suffering. The roads are terrible where they exist at all, and vast stretches of the route pass through wilderness where no roads have ever been built. You walk until your feet bleed, then wrap them in rags and keep walking. The food runs short within weeks, and you find yourself eating whatever the land provides: roots, berries, the occasional stolen chicken. The water is worse. Every stream, every well, every puddle becomes a gamble. You drink because you must, knowing that the water might bring relief or might bring illness. It usually brings illness. Dysentery becomes your constant companion. The cramping, the urgent need to find privacy a dozen times a day, the bloody stool that tells you something deep inside has gone very wrong. These are the baseline conditions of crusading life. Historians still argue whether more crusaders died from disease than from combat, but most estimates suggest that illness claimed far more lives than Saracen swords ever did. The armies that set out tens of thousands strong arrived at their destinations as mere fractions of their original force, winnowed by fever and flux and the countless other ailments that flourished in conditions of poor sanitation, contaminated water and exhausted immune systems. You survive the march somehow, and find yourself in the strange and hostile landscape of the Levant. The heat is unlike anything you've experienced in your northern European home. The sun beats down with an intensity that feels personal, as if God himself is testing your resolve. Your woolen clothing, perfectly suited to the cool dampness of home, becomes a portable oven. You sweat constantly, losing fluids faster than you can replace them. The local water sources are unfamiliar and often controlled by enemies. When you do find water, you share it with thousands of other thirsty crusaders and their horses and their livestock, all of them contributing their own diseases to the communal supply. The local diseases are unlike anything your immune system has ever encountered. Malaria breeds in the coastal swamps, carried by mosquitoes that descend in clouds at dusk. The recurring fevers and chills leave men shaking and helpless, unable to fight or even march. Leishmaniasis, spread by sandflies, produces horrible skin ulcers that refuse to heal. Typhus lurks wherever lice gather, and lice gather everywhere that unwashed bodies crowd together, which is to say, everywhere in a crusader camp. You scratch constantly, never connecting the itching to the fever that will follow, never understanding that the tiny insects feeding on your blood are injecting bacteria that will set your brain on fire. The crusader camps themselves are studies in disease transmission. Thousands of men packed together with minimal sanitation, their waste accumulating in pits that overflow when it rains, their food prepared by hands that have never been washed. The horses and pack animals add their own contributions to the biological stew. Flies swarm over everything, landing on feces and then on food, carrying pathogens from one to the other in a constant cycle of contamination. You eat your bread with fingers that haven't been clean in months, swatting away flies between bites, never realizing that each meal is a roll of the dice with your intestines as the stakes. The fighting, when it happens, is almost a relief from the slow death by disease. At least in battle you can see your enemy. At least with a sword in your hand you have some agency over your fate. But the wounds you receive in combat carry their own dangers, and we've already discussed the terrors of medieval battlefield medicine. The barber surgeons who accompany the Crusader armies do their best with boiling oil and red-hot irons, but their best often hastens death rather than preventing it. A wound that might have healed cleanly becomes infected after treatment. An infection that might have been localized spreads after probing with unsterilized instruments. The sword that failed to kill you on Tuesday completes its work by Saturday, with the generous assistance of medical intervention. Leprosy stalks the Crusader armies with particular cruelty. The disease was endemic in the Holy Land, and prolonged contact with local populations exposed Crusaders to Mycobacterium leprae, the bacterium that causes this slow-motion horror. The disease took years to develop, which meant that many Crusaders carried it home without knowing they were infected. They returned as heroes, greeted by grateful families and communities, and then slowly began to fall apart. The numbness in fingers and toes, the skin lesions that refused to heal, the gradual loss of digits, of limbs, of facial features. By the time the diagnosis became undeniable, the leper had often spread the infection to family members and neighbours. The Crusades didn't just bring diseases home, they brought diseases that would continue to spread for generations. You witness things in the Holy Land that will haunt you forever. The siege of a city where starvation drives defenders to eat rats, then leather, then things you refuse to name. The aftermath of battles where the dead lie unburied for days, bloating in the sun, their decay seeding the water and the soil with corruption. The hospitals where men lie in rows, dying of wounds and fever and homesickness, calling for mothers who are thousands of miles away. The faith that brought you here is tested daily by the reality of what holy war actually looks like, smells like, feels like. Some Crusaders lose their faith entirely. Others grip it tighter, convinced that sufficient suffering must eventually be rewarded. The diseases you encounter go by many names, some medical and some colloquial, but their effects are universally devastating. The bloody flux, dysentery in modern terminology, kills more Crusaders than any other single cause. The sweating fever might be malaria, or might be typhus, or might be something else entirely, its symptoms overlapping too much for medieval observers to distinguish clearly. The wasting sickness could be tuberculosis, contracted from close quarters with infected comrades. The skin rotting might be leishmaniasis, or might be gangrene from an untreated wound. You watch your companions succumb one by one, their names forgotten as quickly as their bodies are buried, the crusading army shrinking with every passing week. Those who survive the crusade often find that survival is only temporary. The diseases they carry home with them continue to work their destruction for years afterward. Malaria survivors experience recurring bouts of fever for the rest of their lives, weakening them with each episode. Leprosy progresses slowly but inexorably, gradually stripping away the flesh until death finally offers release. The psychological damage is equally lasting. Men who witnessed the horrors of the Crusades return changed, haunted by memories that medieval society has no framework for treating. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was simply dismissed as cowardice or spiritual weakness, leaving survivors to struggle alone with demons of their own making. You return home years later, thinner and weaker than when you left. The fever comes and goes now, a souvenir from some swamp you barely remember crossing. Your skin shows scars from wounds and diseases alike, a map of suffering written on your body. Your family greets you with joy, but you see the concern behind their smiles. You're not the person who left. You're not sure you're a person at all anymore, just a collection of symptoms and memories held together by habit and stubbornness. The Holy Land took something from you that you'll never get back. The diseases you carry will continue to take more until there's nothing left to take. The church bells ring on Sunday, celebrating the return of Crusaders who brought back relics and stories and glory. They don't ring for the thousands who died along the way, whose bodies rot in unmarked graves stretching from your village to Jerusalem and back. They don't ring for the diseases those survivors brought home, seeding new outbreaks in communities that had never known such afflictions. The Crusades were sold as a path to spiritual salvation, but for the populations of Europe, they were also a vast exchange of pathogens, a biological mixing of east and west that would continue to kill long after the last soldier came home. You cough into your hand and wonder if this latest fever is a passing thing or the beginning of your end. The Holy Land, it seems, isn't finished with you yet. You've survived the Crusades, barely, but the fevers that followed you home from the Holy Land are nothing compared to what's about to strike. The year is 1485, and you find yourself in England during one of history's most peculiar and terrifying epidemics. A new disease has appeared, one that kills with a speed and selectivity that seems almost personal. They're calling it the sweating sickness, and it has a particular taste for the young, the healthy and the wealthy. If you're poor and weak, you might actually stand a better chance. If you're a robust gentleman in the prime of life, start writing your will now, because you might not see sunset. The sweating sickness announces itself with a sense of dread, a premonition of doom that survivors describe as unmistakable. You feel it coming before any physical symptoms appear, a cold certainty that something terrible is happening inside your body. Then the sweating begins. Not ordinary perspiration, but a drenching, soaking flood of sweat that saturates your clothing and your bedding within minutes. Your heart races. Your head pounds. A desperate thirst consumes you, but drinking seems to provide no relief. The heat inside your body builds to unbearable levels while your extremities grow cold. You're simultaneously burning and freezing, your body's temperature regulation system completely overthrown by whatever is happening inside you. The most terrifying aspect of the sweating sickness is its speed. You might feel perfectly healthy at breakfast and be dead by dinner. The disease progresses through stages so rapidly that families barely have time to fetch a physician before the patient is beyond help. First, the sense of dread, then the profuse sweating, then the cardiac symptoms, palpitations, chest pain, a pulse that races and then falters. If you survive the first 24 hours, your chances improve dramatically. If you can make it through the night, you'll probably live. But that first day is a gauntlet that kills roughly half of everyone who runs it. Historians still argue whether the sweating sickness was a unique disease that has since disappeared, or a variant of something we still recognise today. The leading candidates include hantavirus, a rodent-borne illness that can cause similar symptoms, and some form of viral hemorrhagic fever related to Ebola or Marburg. The problem is that none of these modern diseases perfectly matches the historical descriptions. Hantavirus doesn't typically kill within hours. Known hemorrhagic fevers don't usually cause the extreme sweating that gave the English disease its name. We may never know exactly what killed those thousands of Tudor Englishmen, because whatever it was seems to have vanished from the earth as mysteriously as it appeared. The sweating sickness struck England 5 times between 1485 and 1551, each outbreak killing thousands before disappearing almost as suddenly as it arrived. The first epidemic coincided eerily with the arrival of Henry VII's forces to claim the English throne, leading to speculation that the Tudor soldiers had brought the disease with them from France or Brittany. Henry's coronation celebrations were cut short as members of his court began dropping dead. The new king, not yet crowned, watched his closest advisors and supporters succumb to a disease nobody understood. His reign began under a cloud of death that many interpreted as an ominous sign. You lie in your bed, soaked in your own sweat, feeling your heart flutter dangerously in your chest. The physician who attends you is as baffled as everyone else. He advises you to stay warm, a logical seeming recommendation that probably killed as many patients as it saved. Survivors of the sweating sickness often reported that staying too warm worsened their symptoms, while those who threw off their covers and exposed themselves to cool air sometimes recovered. But medieval medical logic held that sweating was the body's attempt to expel disease, and therefore more sweating must be better. Patients were wrapped in blankets, placed near fires, and given hot drinks, essentially being cooked alive while their overheating bodies desperately tried to cool down. The wealthy died in disproportionate numbers, a pattern so striking that contemporary observers couldn't help but comment on it. The poor, living in drafty cottages with inadequate heating, often survived while their landlords perished in well-insulated manor houses. Some speculated that the disease was divine punishment for the sins of the rich. Others noted that the wealthy could afford to follow medical advice more thoroughly, wrapping themselves in expensive blankets and maintaining roaring fires that the poor couldn't afford. The irony was exquisite. The best medical care money could buy was actively increasing mortality rates. The poor survived because they couldn't afford to be treated. The disease had a peculiar preference for Englishmen that puzzled everyone who observed it. When sweating sickness spread to the European continent in 1529, it tore through Germany, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, but France and Italy were largely spared. Why would a disease respect national boundaries? Modern theories suggest that genetic factors might have played a role, with certain populations carrying genes that made them more or less susceptible. Or perhaps the disease was spread by a particular species of rodent or insect that was common in some regions but not others. The mystery deepens the more closely you examine it. Anne Boleyn, who would later become Henry VIII's ill-fated second wife, contracted the sweating sickness in 1528 and survived. Henry, terrified of the disease that had haunted his family since his father's coronation, fled from location to location, staying ahead of outbreaks and ruthlessly abandoning anyone in his household who showed symptoms. His fear was rational. The disease killed people like him, young and healthy and privileged, with a selectivity that seemed almost mocking. When Anne fell ill, Henry sent his physician to attend her, but refused to visit in person. Love had its limits when the sweating sickness was involved. The final outbreak in 1551 was the most devastating, sweeping through England and then across the continent with renewed fury. Towns lost a third of their populations in weeks, markets closed, churches emptied as congregations dwindled. The disease struck so quickly that people would collapse in the streets, sweating and trembling, dead before help could arrive. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The sweating sickness vanished from history, never to return. No explanation was ever found. No cure was ever developed. The disease simply disappeared, leaving behind only terrified memories and scholarly puzzlement. You survived somehow, emerging from your sweat-soaked bed, weak but alive. The fever broke sometime in the night, and you woke to find your heart beating steadily again. The terrible sense of doom lifted. You're one of the lucky ones. Your neighbour wasn't so fortunate. He died within 6 hours of the first symptoms, his body carried out for burial before you even knew he was sick. The disease shows no pattern that makes sense. It takes the young and spares the old, takes the strong and spares the weak, takes your neighbour and spares you for reasons that will never be explained. The psychological toll of the sweating sickness was almost as devastating as the physical mortality. People lived in constant fear of sudden death, knowing that any moment of unease might be the harbinger of their end. Some became paranoid, refusing to leave their homes or receive visitors. Others adopted a fatalistic hedonism, reasoning that life was too short and uncertain for caution. The disease came and went so unpredictably that no precaution seemed to help. Fleeing to the countryside didn't save you. Staying in the city didn't doom you. Prayer was equally ineffective. The sweating sickness was a reminder that death could arrive at any moment, without warning, without reason, without mercy. After 1551, the sweating sickness never returned to England or anywhere else. Whatever pathogen caused it either evolved into something less deadly, found a different host species, or simply went extinct. We may never know. The disease exists now only in historical records and scholarly speculation, a medical mystery that defies explanation. But for those who lived through its 5 deadly visitations, the sweating sickness was as real and terrifying as any plague or famine. You carry the memory of those hours in your sweat-soaked bed for the rest of your life, the moment when death stood at your shoulder and then, inexplicably, turned away. The bells toll for another funeral, another victim who didn't share your luck. You watch the procession pass and wonder why you were spared. There's no answer, of course. There never is. You simply survived, and now you must go on living in a world where death can arrive without warning, where no precaution guarantees safety, where the only certainty is uncertainty itself. The sweating sickness taught Tudor England a lesson that medieval people knew all too well. Your life is not your own, and it can be taken from you at any moment by forces you will never understand. You walk home through streets that seem emptier than before, and you try not to think about what illness might strike next. You've dodged the sweating sickness, survived the Crusades, recovered from your poisoning, and somehow kept dancing plagues and famines from claiming your life. But now you face a danger that has nothing to do with disease or contamination, a danger that threatens half the population with terrifying regularity. If you happen to be a woman of childbearing age in medieval Europe, Your greatest statistical threat isn't plague or war or starvation, it's pregnancy. The simple act of bringing new life into the world killed women at rates that would be considered a public health emergency today. Childbirth was less a joyous occasion than a game of Russian roulette, and the odds were not in your favour. You feel the first contractions begin in the early hours of the morning, and the midwife is summoned to attend you. She arrives with her bag of tools and remedies, her experience earned through dozens of similar births, her hands unwashed because nobody has yet discovered that hand-washing matters. She examines you with fingers that were recently mucking out a chicken coop, or kneading bread dough, or doing whatever else needed doing before your summons arrived. She means well. Everyone means well. But the bacteria she introduces into your birth canal during that examination may kill you more surely than any complication of labour itself. The numbers are staggering when you contemplate them. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1 and 3% of all births in medieval Europe resulted in maternal death, with some estimates running even higher. That might not sound catastrophic until you remember that medieval women typically experienced many pregnancies over their lifetimes. 8, 10, 12 or more was not unusual. If each pregnancy carries a 1 in 50 chance of killing you, and you experience 10 pregnancies, your cumulative odds of dying in childbirth approach 20%, 1 in 5. Roll the dice enough times, and the odds eventually catch up with you. The causes of maternal death were numerous, and, from a medieval perspective, essentially untreatable. Hemorrhage claimed countless lives when placentas failed to detach properly, or uteruses refused to contract after delivery. Without blood transfusions, without medications to stimulate uterine contraction, without surgical intervention capabilities, a woman who began bleeding heavily after birth could only be watched as she faded away. The midwife might pack the wound with cloth, might apply pressure, might pray fervently, but none of these measures could replace the blood pouring out of the dying mother's body. Obstructed labour was another common killer. When babies presented in difficult positions, breech, transverse, or with the cord wrapped around their necks, medieval midwives had few options. They might attempt to manually reposition the baby, reaching into the birth canal with those unwashed hands and trying to guide the infant into a deliverable position. Sometimes this worked, often it didn't, and the prolonged labour that followed exhausted both mother and child. After days of fruitless contractions, the baby frequently died in the womb, and the mother followed shortly after as infection set in, or her body simply gave out from exhaustion. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives were skilled practitioners, doing their best with limited tools, or dangerous amateurs whose interventions caused more harm than good. The truth likely varied enormously from one midwife to another. Some had genuine expertise, passed down through generations of women's knowledge, and achieved outcomes that were remarkably good given the circumstances. Others were barely trained, thrust into the role by community need rather than personal competence, and their fumbling interventions undoubtedly killed mothers who might otherwise have survived. The lack of formal training, standardised practices, or regulatory oversight meant that the quality of care you received was essentially random. The remedies available for difficult births range from useless to actively harmful. You might be given potions to speed labour, herbal concoctions containing ergot, which could cause dangerous uterine contractions, or other plant compounds with unpredictable effects. You might be placed in various positions believed to facilitate delivery, squatting, standing, lying on your side, based on folk wisdom that had no particular medical basis. You might be encouraged to drink wine or ale to dull the pain, which might help your mental state but did nothing for the physical complications threatening your life. And if all else failed, you might receive the last rites, your soul's preparation for heaven taking priority over your body's increasingly hopeless struggle. Caesarean sections existed in medieval Europe, but they were performed almost exclusively on women who were already dead or clearly dying. The procedure was intended to save the baby's soul by allowing baptism before death, not to save the mother's life. The surgical techniques, the anaesthesia, the antiseptic practices necessary to make caesarean delivery survivable simply didn't exist. A living woman who received a caesarean section was a woman whose death had already been accepted. The surgery merely hastened what was seen as inevitable, while offering the consolation of a baptized infant. You labour through the day and into the night, the contractions coming faster and stronger, the pain building to levels that make you wonder if death might actually be preferable. The midwife murmurs encouragement, checking your progress with those contaminated fingers, offering sips of water and words of comfort. The baby is coming slowly, too slowly, and you see concern growing in the midwife's eyes even as her voice remains calm. The other women gathered in the birthing room exchange glances that they think you don't notice. They've seen this before. They know how it can end. Some of them have lost sisters, mothers, daughters to this same struggle. They pray quietly while they wait to see which way the balance tips. Puerperal fever was the great invisible killer, the one that struck days after apparently successful deliveries. Also called childbed fever, it was a bacterial infection introduced during labour or delivery, typically by the hands of birth attendants. The symptoms began with fever and chills, progressing to abdominal pain, rapid heartbeat, and the distinctive foul-smelling discharge that indicated something had gone terribly wrong inside. Women who had survived the trauma of delivery, who had held their newborn infants and felt the relief of labour's end, found themselves sickening and dying within a week. The connection between unwashed hands and infection wouldn't be established until the 19th century, when Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated that hand-washing could dramatically reduce maternal mortality. Medieval women died by the thousands for want of soap and water. The psychological burden on women who survived multiple pregnancies was immense, though rarely documented in sources written primarily by men. Each pregnancy brought the awareness that this might be the one that killed you. Each labour was a confrontation with mortality, a passage through the valley of the shadow of death that your culture dressed in ritual and prayer but could not actually make safe. Some women must have dreaded pregnancy with a terror that coloured their entire experience of marriage and sexuality. Others perhaps achieved a fatalistic acceptance, trusting God or fate to determine their outcomes. The silence of the historical record on women's inner experiences leaves us only able to imagine. Your labour ends finally after a day and a night of struggle. The baby emerges, red-faced and wailing, and the midwife cuts the cord with a knife that has never been sterilised. You feel the placenta pass, the final contractions easing, and for a moment there is only relief and exhaustion. You've done it. You've survived another birth. Your older children, waiting anxiously in another room, are brought in to meet their new sibling. Your spouse weeps with joy and gratitude. The immediate danger has passed, but the fever begins 3 days later. The chills, the sweating, the pain deep in your belly that tells you something is terribly wrong. The midwife is summoned again, and this time her face shows the knowledge she tries to hide. Childbed fever. The invisible killer that claims women who seem to have escaped every other danger. You lie in your bed, nursing the infant who may soon be motherless, watching the light change through the window as the fever climbs higher and higher. The priest comes to hear your confession. Your family gathers to say goodbye. The life you fought so hard to bring into the world may cost you your own. Whether you live or die from this fever is a matter of biology and luck, not medicine. Some women's immune systems manage to fight off the infection. Others succumb within days. The medieval world offers no antibiotics, no surgical intervention, no effective treatment of any kind. You can only wait and pray and hope that your body is stronger than the bacteria multiplying inside you. The baby cries for milk, and you wonder if you'll live long enough to see this child take its first steps, speak its first words, grow into the person it might become. The uncertainty is absolute. The outcome is out of your hands. The fever breaks after 5 agonizing days, and you survive childbed fever through sheer biological fortune, rather than any medical intervention. You're weak, depleted, but alive. Your body has fought off an infection that kills countless women every year, and now you face the long process of recovery in a world that offers little in the way of rest or support for new mothers. But as you regain your strength and resume the daily routines of medieval life, you confront a danger so ubiquitous, so constant, so woven into the fabric of everyday existence that you barely register it as a threat. The water, every sip you take, every meal you prepare, every moment you spend near the rivers and wells that sustain your community, exposes you to pathogens that turn your intestines into a perpetual battleground. You wake thirsty in the night as you often do and reach for the cup of water beside your bed. The water came from the town well yesterday morning, carried home in a wooden bucket that has never been cleaned with anything stronger than a quick rinse. The well itself draws from groundwater that has been filtered through soil, containing the waste of every human and animal living nearby. The cesspit behind your neighbour's house is perhaps 30 feet from the well. The tannery upstream dumps its runoff into the same aquifer. The butcher's waste, the dyer's chemicals, the accumulated excrement of 1,000 years of human habitation, all of it seeps into the water table and eventually into your cup. You drink deeply, grateful for the refreshment, completely unaware that you've just ingested a bacterial cocktail that would make a modern health inspector faint. Dysentery is not an occasional affliction in the medieval world. It's a baseline condition. Almost everyone experiences it regularly. The cramping and diarrhea are so common that it barely warrants mention in daily conversation. You've had loose bowels for so long that you've forgotten what normal digestion feels like. The chronic intestinal distress saps your energy, compromises your nutrition, and keeps your immune system in a constant state of low-grade activation. When more serious illnesses arrive, they find a body already weakened by the perpetual assault of waterborne pathogens. The plague, the sweating sickness, the various fevers that sweep through your community, all of them hit harder because your system is already exhausted from fighting the invisible war in your gut. The rivers that provide water for drinking, cooking and washing are simultaneously used for purposes that make them spectacularly unsafe. Upstream from your town, tanners soak animal hides in vats of urine and feces to loosen the hair before scraping. The runoff flows into the river. Butchers dump offal and blood into the current, attracting rats and flies that carry their own cargo of disease. Dyers pour chemical waste into the water, colouring its strange hues that probably should warn you away but don't, because every river near every town looks equally polluted. And at regular intervals along the banks, people squat to relieve themselves directly into the flow, adding their personal contributions to the biological soup that will eventually reach your cup. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the connection between contaminated water and disease. Some evidence suggests a folk understanding that certain water sources were safer than others. Springs emerging fresh from the ground were preferred over stagnant ponds, and wells were considered superior to rivers. But the mechanism of contamination remained mysterious. The theory of miasma, which held that disease spread through bad air rather than bad water, dominated medical thinking. The smell of polluted water might warn you away, but if the water looked clear and smelled acceptable, you assumed it was safe. The bacteria thriving invisibly in that clear, odourless water went about their deadly work unimpeded by human understanding. Typhoid fever lurked in contaminated water, ready to strike anyone who drank from the wrong source. The disease began with fever and headache, progressing to abdominal pain, rose-coloured spots on the chest, and the distinctive intestinal symptoms that gave typhoid its terror. In severe cases, the intestines could perforate, spilling bacteria-laden contents into the abdominal cavity and causing fatal peritonitis. Medieval communities experienced typhoid outbreaks regularly, especially during summer months when warm temperatures accelerated bacterial growth. The dead piled up, their graves marked by grieving families who had no idea that the water they continued to drink was continuing to spread the disease. Cholera wasn't yet present in medieval Europe. It would arrive later, carried from South Asia by trade routes. But other forms of severe diarrheal disease achieved similar effects. The bacterium that causes cholera has cousins that flourished in medieval water supplies, producing symptoms of massive fluid loss that could kill through dehydration within hours. You've seen it happen. A healthy person complaining of stomach upset in the morning, violently ill by noon, dead by nightfall, their body drained of fluids faster than anyone could replace them. The speed of death from acute intestinal infection was terrifying, and the only treatment available, drinking more water, often meant ingesting more of the pathogen that was killing you. The animals that share your living space contribute their own diseases to the water supply. Remember those rats we discussed, the ones whose highways run beneath every medieval city? Their droppings contain leptospirosis bacteria, which wash into water sources during rains and cause fever, kidney failure, and liver damage in humans who come into contact with contaminated water. Your livestock, the pigs and chickens and cattle that wander freely through your village, deposit feces that harbour parasites and bacteria that complete their life cycles by passing through human intestines. The cycle is endless and inescapable. Animals contaminate water, humans drink water, humans become ill, humans contaminate more water, and the wheel keeps turning. You visit the local bathhouse, seeking cleanliness and sociability in equal measure. Medieval bathhouses were popular gathering places, offering hot water, relaxation, and the chance to scrub away the accumulated grime of daily life. They were also spectacular venues for disease transmission. The water was heated but rarely changed, meaning that dozens of bathers shared the same liquid, each contributing their skin bacteria, their bodily fluids, their parasites to the communal pool. The warm, moist environment was perfect for pathogen survival and transmission. You emerge from the bathhouse feeling clean but carrying a fresh cargo of microorganisms acquired from your fellow bathers. The pursuit of hygiene paradoxically increased your disease exposure. Wells were supposed to be safer, but wells had their own problems. The stone or wooden lining of a typical well was porous enough to allow groundwater seepage, meaning that anything dumped on the ground within a certain radius would eventually find its way into the water supply. Medieval people understood that wells shouldn't be dug directly adjacent to cesspits, but the safe distance was dramatically underestimated. Bacteria from human waste could travel 30 feet or more through soil before being filtered out, and most medieval wells were dug far closer to sources of contamination than that. Every drink from the well was a game of distance and dilution, with your intestines as the stakes. The wealthy sometimes had access to private wells or springs, but wealth was no guarantee of safety. The finest manor houses often featured elaborate plumbing systems that delivered water through lead pipes. Remember that lead poisoning we discussed earlier? Now you're drinking it directly every day in the water that seemed like such a luxury compared to the common well. The constant low-level lead exposure joined the constant low-level intestinal infections in a symphony of chronic illness that weakened noble and common alike. The wealthy might die more slowly from their better water, but they still died. Your morning routine involves fetching water from the well, boiling some of it for porridge, and drinking the rest unboiled because fuel is expensive and boiling water for every use is impractical. The porridge is probably safe. The boiling killed whatever pathogens lurked in the water. But the cup you drink with it is not. The cycle of infection and reinfection continues, your gut flora in constant flux as new bacterial invaders arrive daily. You've developed a certain immunity to the most common waterborne diseases, your body adapted to the specific microbial environment of your community. But this adaptation comes at a cost, and travelling to a new area with different pathogens can trigger severe illness even in adults who have survived childhood. Children die from diarrheal disease in staggering numbers. Their smaller bodies can't tolerate the fluid loss that adults might survive. The dehydration sets in quickly, their little forms shrivelling as water pours out of them faster than it can be replaced. You've buried children who seemed healthy in the morning and were gone by evening, victims of water that looked perfectly clean. The frequency of child death from intestinal illness is so high that it's simply accepted as an unavoidable tragedy, one of the many ways that the young are culled before reaching adulthood. Perhaps half of all children born in medieval Europe died before age 5, and waterborne disease was one of the leading killers. You finish your water and feel the familiar rumble in your gut that signals another day of chronic intestinal distress. You're used to it now. Everyone is used to it. The urgent trips to the latrine, the cramping that comes and goes, the general sense of digestive unease that never quite resolves. These are simply the background conditions of medieval existence. You don't know that clean water and proper sanitation could eliminate most of this suffering. You don't know that the water you drink is slowly killing you, one pathogen at a time. You only know that you're thirsty again, and the well is waiting and the bucket needs to be filled for tomorrow's cooking and drinking and dying. The water continues to poison you slowly, but now a new terror sweeps through your town, one that combines disease, faith, and violence in equal measure. The year is 1349, the plague is at its height, and people are desperately seeking explanations for why God has abandoned them. The priests say it's punishment for sin. The physicians mumble about planetary alignments and corrupted air. But neither explanation offers any hope of stopping the dying. And then you hear the drums in the distance, the chanting, the crack of leather against flesh. The flagellants are coming, and they're bringing their own special brand of salvation and contagion to your doorstep. You join the crowd gathering in the town square to witness their arrival. They march in orderly rows, hundreds of them, dressed in simple robes marked with red crosses. Their backs are bare, the skin flayed raw by repeated self-punishment, blood running down to stain their clothing and drip onto the cobblestones. As they enter the square, they form a circle and begin their ritual. The master flagellant leads the prayers, and at his signal the brothers raise their whips, leather straps embedded with metal spikes, and begin to beat themselves in synchronized rhythm. The crack of impact, the spray of blood, the ecstatic groaning of men convinced they're earning divine favour through suffering. It's mesmerising and horrifying in equal measure. The flagellant movement exploded across Europe during the Black Death, drawing thousands of participants who believed that extreme penance could appease an angry god and stop the plague. They marched from town to town in organised processions, performing their bloody rituals in public squares, attracting crowds of desperate onlookers who saw in their suffering a hope that ordinary prayer had failed to provide. The flagellants rejected the authority of the Church, administered their own sacraments, and claimed that their 33.5-day processions, one day for each year of Christ's life, could wash away sins and earn salvation for participants and witnesses alike. Historians still argue whether the flagellant movement was a genuine religious awakening, a mass psychogenic phenomenon, or simply an organised response to unbearable terror. Elements of all three seem present. The flagellants had rules, hierarchies and rituals that suggest conscious organisation, but the frenzy of their self-punishment, the ecstatic states many participants reported, and the sheer scale of the movement suggest something beyond rational planning. When your world is dying around you, when bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, when every authority you trusted has failed to protect you, perhaps the only response left is to beat yourself bloody in the town square and hope God notices. The problem, of course, is that the flagellants didn't stop the plague, they spread it. Think about what you're watching in that town square. Hundreds of people pressed together, many of them already infected with Yersinia pestis, sharing fleas and breath and blood in an orgy of close contact. The flagellants travelled constantly, moving from town to town, carrying the disease with them like a banner. A town that might have escaped the worst of the plague by isolating itself instead welcomed the flagellants as spiritual saviours, receiving the death they brought along with the prayers. The blood spraying from whipped backs carried more than symbolic significance. If any flagellant bore the pneumonic form of plague, that blood and those heavy breaths could transmit bacteria directly to the crowd. You stand close enough to feel the spray, caught up in the religious fervour of the moment. The flagellant's certainty is contagious, their conviction that this suffering means something, that their pain can purchase God's mercy for a dying world. You find yourself weeping, caught between terror and hope, as the blood flows and the prayers rise. The man beside you coughs heavily, and you feel the warm mist of his breath on your cheek. Somewhere in that crowd, fleas are hopping from body to body, finding new hosts, spreading the very disease the flagellants claim to be fighting. The ritual that's meant to end the plague is actually accelerating it, but nobody understands this. How could they? The connection between close contact and disease transmission won't be understood for centuries. The flagellants' theology was as dangerous as their epidemiology. They taught that the plague was God's punishment for sin, which meant someone must have committed especially terrible sins to provoke such terrible punishment. The search for scapegoats intensified wherever the flagellants went. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague deliberately. When the flagellants arrived in a town, pogroms often followed. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, their members burned alive in their synagogues or slaughtered in the streets. The flagellants didn't always participate directly in these killings, but their preaching created the atmosphere of hysteria and blame-seeking that made murder seem righteous. The Church initially tolerated the flagellant movement, perhaps hoping it would channel popular terror into relatively harmless religious expression. But as the movement grew more radical, rejecting clerical authority and administering unauthorized sacraments, Church officials became alarmed. Pope Clement VI eventually condemned the flagellants in 1349, ordering their suppression throughout Christendom. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands had marched, thousands had watched, thousands had died, both from the plague the flagellants spread and from the violence their preaching inspired. The movement gradually faded as the Black Death's first wave subsided, but flagellant processions would reappear with each subsequent outbreak, a persistent symptom of the psychological wounds the plague left on European society. You return home from the square, your clothing spotted with blood that isn't yours, your mind churning with what you've witnessed. The flagellants' conviction was absolute. They truly believed their suffering would save the world. And who are you to argue? The priest's prayers haven't stopped the dying. The physician's remedies haven't cured a single victim. At least the flagellants are doing something, taking action, refusing to simply wait for death. Perhaps their blood really will appease God's wrath. Perhaps the plague will end tomorrow, and everyone will know it was because of those brave men with their whips and their faith. But the plague doesn't end tomorrow. It keeps killing, relentlessly, indifferent to the blood spilled in town squares across Europe. Your neighbour dies 3 days after the flagellant's visit, her body covered with the buboes you've learned to recognise with sick dread. Her husband follows a day later. Their children last a bit longer, but by week's end the entire family is gone. You wonder if the flagellants brought this death with them, if the crowd gathered to witness their ritual became a harvesting ground for the plague. But you push the thought away. The flagellants are holy men doing God's work. They couldn't possibly be spreading the very evil they fight. The alternative explanation, that God isn't listening, that no amount of suffering will stop the dying, is too terrible to contemplate. The violence inspired by the flagellants lingers long after their processions move on. The accusations against Jews spread through your community, whispered at first and then shouted openly. Someone has to be responsible for this catastrophe. Someone has to pay. The well-poisoning accusations are absurd. Jews drink from the same wells as everyone else, and they're dying of plague in the same numbers. But reason has no purchase in a world gone mad with fear and grief. You watch as your Jewish neighbours are rounded up, accused, tortured into false confessions and executed. Their property is seized, their homes burned, their children killed alongside their parents. The flagellants have moved on to the next town, but the hatred they stirred remains, bearing its own poisonous fruit. The psychological impact of the flagellant movement extended far beyond the immediate violence. It represented a fundamental breakdown of the normal religious order, a rejection of the institutional church in favour of direct, unmediated access to God. This challenge to authority would echo through European history, contributing eventually to the Reformation and the religious wars that followed. The flagellants also demonstrated how terror could be weaponized, how a population desperate for answers could be directed toward violence against scapegoats. The same pattern would repeat countless times in subsequent centuries, the same search for someone to blame, the same conviction that sufficient suffering must merit divine intervention. You lie awake that night, listening for the drums that would signal another procession approaching, the flagellants chanting echoes in your memory, their blood-streaked faces suspended in your mind's eye. They were so certain, so absolutely convinced that their pain had meaning, that their blood was purchasing salvation. You want to believe them. You desperately want to believe that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening and knows how to stop it. But the bodies keep piling up, the carts keep rolling through the streets, the graves keep filling faster than they can be dug. If God is listening to the flagellants' prayers, he's taking his time answering. The morning brings news that the flagellants have reached the next town, where another crowd gathered to watch, where another spray of blood misted the air, where another cluster of infected and uninfected pressed together in terrible intimacy. The plague follows in their wake like a loyal dog, and they never seem to notice. Their faith shields them from the truth that modern epidemiologists would find obvious. They're not fighting the plague, they're feeding it. But perhaps that's the most human response to catastrophe, to do something, anything, even if that something makes everything worse. At least the flagellants aren't simply waiting to die. At least they're going down swinging, even if their swings land on their own backs. The flagellants have moved on, leaving bloodstains in the town square and fresh graves in the churchyard. But the desperation that drove people to whip themselves bloody doesn't fade with their departure. As the famine years grind on, as plague waves return again and again, as every form of suffering seems to compound upon the last, some communities cross a line that separates the desperate from the damned. The whispers reach you in fragments at first, rumours from besieged cities, tales from travellers who speak in hushed tones and refuse to meet your eyes, stories of parents and children, of neighbours and strangers, of hunger so absolute that it devours not just the body but the soul. Stories of cannibalism. You don't want to believe these stories, nobody wants to believe them. But the chroniclers of the age set them down in ink with a matter-of-factness that suggests they were recording observed reality rather than hysterical rumour. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, multiple independent sources report incidents of anthropophagy across northern Europe. The Chronicle of the Abbey of Tournai, which we mentioned earlier, states plainly that parents ate their children and children ate their parents. Irish annals record similar horrors. German sources describe bodies exhumed from fresh graves and consumed by the starving living. When you read enough of these accounts from enough different places written by enough different hands, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss as mere legend. The siege chronicles are the most detailed and the most disturbing. When a city was surrounded by enemy forces and cut off from food supplies, starvation set in with terrible speed. The pattern was grimly predictable. First the horses were eaten, then the dogs and cats, then the rats and mice, then the leather goods. Shoes, belts, book bindings boiled into something that could be chewed and swallowed. And then, when everything else was gone, the dying began to provide sustenance for the living. The Siege of Ma'ara by Crusaders in 1098 produced eyewitness accounts of Christian soldiers consuming the bodies of their Muslim enemies. The Crusader chronicler Radulf of Caen wrote of this without apparent shock, as though the extremity of the circumstances justified the extremity of the response. Historians still argue whether these accounts represent widespread practice or isolated incidents exaggerated by horrified observers. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Cannibalism has occurred in virtually every documented famine severe enough to threaten total population extinction, from the siege of Leningrad in World War II back to the earliest recorded human histories. The medieval period, with its repeated famines, its prolonged sieges, its complete lack of emergency food reserves or relief systems, created conditions under which the ultimate taboo became, for some, the only alternative to death. Not everyone crossed that line, but enough did that the chronicles felt compelled to record it. You hear the story of a woman in a village to the north, arrested for killing and consuming her own children during the famine years. The tale spreads through your community, with the horrified fascination that such stories always generate. The woman claimed she couldn't bear to watch her children starve slowly, that killing them quickly was a mercy, that eating their bodies was simply practical in a world where food had ceased to exist. The authorities executed her, of course, but not before her testimony was recorded in exhaustive, nauseating detail. You try not to imagine her circumstances. You try not to imagine what you might do if faced with the same impossible choice. You fail. The psychological mechanisms that allow humans to commit cannibalism under extreme circumstances have been studied extensively by modern researchers. Starvation produces profound changes in brain chemistry and cognitive function. Judgment deteriorates, impulse control weakens, the desperate need for calories overrides increasingly feeble moral objections. People in the late stages of starvation report that they stop seeing food as anything other than fuel. The categories of edible and inedible collapse as the body demands sustenance at any cost. The medieval peasant watching their family starve would have experienced this same cognitive transformation, their moral universe shrinking to a single imperative: survive. The corpses of the recently dead presented a different moral calculus than murder. Some accounts distinguish carefully between those who killed to eat and those who merely consumed bodies that were already deceased. The latter was still horrifying, still a violation of sacred customs regarding the treatment of the dead, but it carried a different weight of guilt. If your neighbour died of starvation yesterday, and their body lies unburied because you lack the strength to dig a grave, and your own children are crying with hunger, and you know that flesh is flesh regardless of its origin, the temptation must have been almost unbearable. Some resisted, some didn't. The chronicles record both with the same dispassionate horror. You walk through your village market, such as it is during these lean years, and you notice people looking at each other differently. There's a calculation in their eyes now, an assessment that goes beyond social status or personal history. Who among us would cross that line? Who among us already has? The rumours about certain households persist, whispered accusations that never quite rise to official notice. The family whose children somehow survived when everyone else's died. The man who seems suspiciously well fed for someone with no visible food source. The woman who refuses to discuss what happened to her elderly mother during the worst of the famine. Nobody wants to ask the questions directly. Nobody wants to hear the answers. The church struggled to provide moral guidance for situations that seemed to transcend normal ethical categories. Was it sinful to eat human flesh to survive? The theologians debated. Some argued that survival was paramount, that God would understand and forgive acts committed under such extreme duress. Others maintained that certain lines could never be crossed, that death was preferable to becoming a cannibal. The official position remained condemnatory, but the pastoral reality was more complicated. Priests hearing confessions from famine survivors had to balance their duty to uphold moral law against their compassion for people who had endured unimaginable suffering. Some granted absolution, some didn't. The records, unsurprisingly, are sparse. The children born during famine years grew up marked by their origins in ways both visible and invisible. Their stunted bodies showed the nutritional deprivation of their earliest years. Their minds carried memories, or half-memories, fragments of experience too young to fully comprehend but too terrible to fully forget, of things they might have seen or heard during the darkest times. The generation that survived the Great Famine passed their trauma to their children, who passed it to theirs, a legacy of horror that shaped European consciousness for centuries. The fairy tales collected in later centuries, stories of children abandoned in forests, of witches who cook and eat the young, of desperate parents making impossible choices, echo the real experiences of famine times, transmuted into narrative form and passed down as warning and memory. You survive the famine years barely, without ever facing the ultimate choice yourself. But you know people who did face it, or you suspect you know them. The village is smaller now, and the survivors share a bond that outsiders can never understand. You don't talk about what happened during the worst of it. You don't ask where certain neighbours went or how certain families managed to survive when survival seemed impossible. The silence is a kind of mercy, a collective agreement to bury the past along with its victims. But late at night, when hunger pangs wake you from thin sleep, you remember the rumours, and you wonder, and you're grateful you never had to find out what you yourself might be capable of. The famine eventually ends, as all famines do, and food becomes available again. People return to something like normal life, planting and harvesting and eating meals that don't require moral compromise. But the memory lingers. The knowledge that civilization is thinner than we like to believe, that the customs and taboos that define us as human can dissolve under sufficient pressure, remains lodged in the collective consciousness. The medieval world understood something that modern people prefer to forget. We are all, under the right circumstances, capable of things we cannot imagine. The famine proved it. The chronicles recorded it. And the silence that followed testified to how desperately people wanted to forget. You break bread with your family, good grain bread made from a decent harvest at last, and you give thanks for the simple miracle of having enough to eat. The children chew happily, unaware of what their parents endured to reach this moment. You watch them eat and you think about the stories from the famine years, the parents who ate their children when no other food remained. The distance between that horror and this ordinary blessing seems both vast and terrifyingly small. One bad harvest, one prolonged siege, one catastrophic failure of the social systems that keep food flowing, and everything could collapse again. You chew your bread slowly, savouring each bite, and you try to believe that such times will never return. They will, of course. They always do. The wheel of plenty and famine has been turning since humanity first scratched seeds into the earth, and it will keep turning long after your bones have turned to dust. But for now, in this moment, there is enough. The bread is warm, the children are fed, and the darkest chapters of human desperation are fading into memory. Tomorrow brings its own troubles. It always does. But tonight, at least, nobody has to face the unthinkable choice between death and the destruction of everything that makes us human. The famine has passed. The cannibalism has faded into whispered memory, and you're beginning to think that perhaps the worst is behind you. But now word reaches your village of something so strange, so inexplicable, that at first you assume the messenger must be drunk or mad. Thousands of children are marching toward the sea, not running away from something, not fleeing war or plague or famine, but marching with purpose and conviction toward the Mediterranean, convinced that God will part the waters for them so they can walk to Jerusalem and reclaim the Holy Land. They have no weapons, no supplies, no adult leadership to speak of. They have only faith. And that faith is about to lead most of them to their deaths. The Children's Crusade of 1212 remains one of the strangest episodes in medieval history, so strange that historians still argue whether it even happened as the chronicles describe. The basic outline seems to be this. In the spring of that year, a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have received a letter from Christ himself, commanding him to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. Word spread with astonishing speed, and within weeks thousands of young people, some accounts say 30,000, others say more, had abandoned their homes and families to follow Stephen toward the sea. A parallel movement emerged in Germany under a boy named Nicholas, drawing similar numbers from the Rhineland and beyond. You watch a column of these young crusaders pass through your village, and the sight is both inspiring and deeply unsettling. They range in age from small children who can barely walk to adolescence on the cusp of adulthood, with a smattering of adults mixed in, some idealistic, some predatory, some simply mad. They sing hymns as they march, their voices rising in innocent faith, convinced that their purity will succeed where the armed might of adult crusaders has failed. The logic, such as it is, holds that previous crusades failed because they were conducted by sinful adults. Only the innocent can truly do God's work. It's a theology that makes a certain kind of sense if you don't think too hard about logistics. The logistics, of course, are a nightmare. These children have no food beyond what they can beg along the way. They have no shelter beyond what sympathetic villagers provide. They have no protection against bandits, wild animals, or the countless other dangers that line medieval roads. As they march south toward the Mediterranean ports, their numbers begin to dwindle. Some die of exhaustion, their young bodies unable to sustain the endless walking on empty stomachs. Some are picked off by opportunistic criminals who see easy targets in these unsupervised children. Some simply give up and try to find their way home, though many are too far from home to have any hope of return. Historians still argue whether the Children's Crusade was truly composed of children, or whether the Latin word used in the Chronicles, pueri, might refer to the landless poor of any age. Some modern scholars suggest that the movement was primarily made up of dispossessed peasants, shepherds, and agricultural labourers whose youth was social rather than biological. Others point to the consistent emphasis on actual childhood in the sources and argue that we should take the chroniclers at their word. The truth may involve both, a core of actual children surrounded by a larger mass of impoverished young adults, all united by desperation and faith in a cause that promised escape from their miserable circumstances. You give bread to a young girl who's fallen behind her column, her feet too blistered to keep up with the march. She can't be more than 10 years old, her face gaunt with hunger, but her eyes still bright with conviction. She thanks you and asks if you'd like to join them. Jerusalem awaits, she explains. The sea will part before them, just as it parted for Moses. God has promised. You watch her limp back toward the road, rejoining the endless stream of children flowing south, and you wonder if you'll ever see her again. You know, somehow, that you won't. The movement reached the Mediterranean coast and stopped. The sea did not part. Stephen of Cloyes and his followers waited at Marseille for the miracle that never came, their faith slowly curdling into confusion and despair. Some accounts say that two merchants named Hugo Ferius and William Porcus offered to transport the children to the Holy Land for free, motivated by supposed piety. The children boarded the ships eagerly, grateful for this apparent divine provision. They were never seen in Europe again. Years later, according to the chronicle of Aubry of Troisfontaine, a priest who had accompanied the expedition returned with news. The merchants had sailed not to the Holy Land but to North Africa, where they sold the children into slavery. 2 ships had sunk in a storm, drowning all aboard. The survivors spent the rest of their short lives in Muslim markets and households, their crusade ending not in Jerusalem but in bondage. The German children under Nicholas fared little better. They attempted to cross the Alps into Italy, and the mountain passes consumed them. The cold, the altitude, the sheer physical impossibility of crossing such terrain without adequate supplies all took their terrible toll. Thousands died in the mountains, their bodies left where they fell, frozen into the ice and snow. Those who made it through to Italy found no ships waiting, no miraculous provision for their journey. Some tried to walk to Rome to seek the Pope's blessing. Most simply scattered, begging their way through Italian towns, trying to find some way home. Few succeeded. Nicholas himself may have died in Italy or may have returned to Germany. The sources disagree, and his ultimate fate remains unknown. You hear the news of the disaster months later, when survivors begin trickling back through your village. They're no longer singing. Their eyes have lost that bright certainty that once made them seem almost luminous. They speak of friends who died on the march, siblings who drowned at sea, companions who were dragged away by slave traders. The faith that launched them on this mad journey has shattered against the rocks of reality, leaving only trauma and confusion in its wake. Some beg for food and shelter as they try to make their way home. Some have no homes to return to. Their families have died or moved on. Their places in the village taken by others. They wander like ghosts, remnants of a dream that became a nightmare. The adults who encouraged or allowed this catastrophe escape any real consequences. The priests who preached about the purity of children's faith. The parents who let their sons and daughters join the march. The authorities who failed to stop a movement that was obviously heading toward disaster. None of them are held accountable. The church quietly distances itself from the whole affair, treating it as a regrettable excess of popular enthusiasm, rather than a predictable tragedy enabled by clerical irresponsibility. The chroniclers record the events with horror, but without assigning blame. The children died, and that's simply what happened. Like an earthquake or a flood, a natural disaster rather than a human failure. You think about that young girl with the blistered feet, the one who asked you to join her march to Jerusalem. Is she dead now, drowned in the Mediterranean or frozen in an Alpine pass? Is she alive, serving in some North African household, her dreams of holy war replaced by the reality of slavery? You'll never know. She's one of 30,000, a single thread in a tapestry of tragedy, her individual fate lost in the mass catastrophe. But you remember her face, her voice, her absolute conviction that God would provide. You remember the bread you gave her, probably one of the last meals she ever received from a sympathetic stranger. You carry that memory forward, a small weight of guilt for the child you could have saved but didn't, for the madness you watched march past without trying to stop it. The Children's Crusade left no lasting political or military impact. No territory was conquered, no battles were won, no objectives were achieved. Its only legacy was death. Tens of thousands of young lives snuffed out or ruined by a movement that should never have been allowed to begin. But it stands as a testament to the peculiar dangers of medieval faith, the way that religious fervour could sweep up entire populations in movements that seemed holy but were actually suicidal. The adults who should have known better failed to intervene. The children who couldn't have known better paid the price, and the wheel of history kept turning, grinding the innocent beneath it as it always has and always will. The road south is quiet now, the endless columns of singing children replaced by the ordinary traffic of merchants and pilgrims. But sometimes, late at night, you think you can still hear them, those high young voices raised in hymns, marching toward a sea that would never part, toward a destiny of death and slavery that awaited them on the other shore. The children are gone, but their ghosts linger, reminders of how easily faith can become a weapon wielded against those too young to protect themselves. The children have marched to their doom, and you remain behind, grateful that your own family stayed home where they belong. But safety is a relative concept in the medieval world, and the danger that now threatens your community doesn't march from afar or sail in on plague ships. It's already here, woven into the very fabric of your town, waiting for a single spark to unleash catastrophe. You smell smoke on the wind tonight, and your blood runs cold. Fire in a medieval city is not merely an emergency, it's an apocalypse. You wake to screaming and the orange glow of flames reflecting off your ceiling. By the time you stumble outside, the bakery 3 houses down is fully engulfed, the flames leaping greedily from its timber frame to the thatch roof of the neighbouring home. The fire spreads with terrifying speed, jumping from building to building like a living thing, feeding on the dry wood and straw that compose virtually every structure in your town. You grab your children and run, joining the stream of panicked neighbours fleeing toward the town gates, but the streets are narrow and crowded, and the smoke is already making it hard to breathe. Behind you, the roar of the fire grows louder and you don't dare look back. Medieval cities were constructed from the perfect fuel for catastrophic fires. The timber frames, the wattle and daub walls, the thatch roofs, the wooden shingles, every element of typical medieval construction was essentially kindling waiting to ignite. Buildings stood close together, often touching or nearly so, with narrow streets that acted as chimneys to channel flames from one block to the next. There were no building codes requiring fire-resistant materials, no setback requirements to create fire breaks, no organised fire departments to respond to emergencies. When a fire started, the only question was how much of the town would burn before it stopped. The sources of ignition were everywhere. Cooking fires burned constantly in every household. Candles and oil lamps provided the only illumination after dark. Forges and kilns operated in the middle of residential neighbourhoods. Bakers worked with massive ovens that burned through the night. Any of these could, and regularly did, escape their containment and spread to the surrounding structures. The fire you're fleeing tonight started when a baker fell asleep while his oven was burning. By the time he woke, his shop was ablaze and the fire had already jumped to the buildings on either side. Within an hour, an entire quarter of the town would be reduced to ash. Historians still argue about the frequency and severity of medieval urban fires, partly because many such disasters went unrecorded, or were mentioned only briefly in chronicles focused on other matters. But the fires that do appear in the historical record are devastating. The Great Fire of London in 1666, though technically post-medieval, followed patterns established over centuries. A fire that started small spread uncontrollably through densely packed wooden buildings and ultimately destroyed most of the city. Similar catastrophes occurred regularly throughout the medieval period. Rouen burned repeatedly. Paris experienced major fires every few decades. Florence, despite its wealth and sophistication, lost entire neighbourhoods to flames. You make it through the gates just as the fire reaches the street you were running down. Looking back, you see your home, the home your grandfather built, the home where your children were born, catch fire and begin to collapse. Everything you own is in there. Your tools, your savings, your clothing, your food stores, your grandmother's loom. All of it is gone in minutes, transformed from the stuff of daily life into smoke and ash rising toward the indifferent stars. You hold your children close and watch your past burn, knowing that you're among the lucky ones. You're alive. Others weren't fast enough, weren't strong enough, weren't awake soon enough. Their bodies will be found in the rubble tomorrow if anything recognisable remains. The firefighting capabilities available to medieval towns were pathetically inadequate. Bucket brigades formed spontaneously, chains of citizens passing containers of water from the nearest well or river toward the flames. But the water supply was never sufficient, the buckets never numerous enough, the human chain never fast enough to outpace a fire that was consuming multiple buildings simultaneously. Some towns maintained hooks and axes that could be used to pull down buildings in the fire's path, creating fire breaks by demolishing structures before the flames could reach them. This was effective when it worked, but deciding whose home to destroy was politically fraught, and hesitation often meant the fire had already jumped past the proposed break before demolition could begin. The wealthy sometimes had access to primitive fire engines, hand-operated pumps that could spray water more effectively than bucket brigades. But these machines were rare, expensive, and difficult to move through narrow medieval streets. By the time one could be brought to the scene of a major fire, the blaze had typically spread far beyond any hope of control. The poor, of course, had no such resources at all. They relied on luck and the mercy of God, neither of which proved reliable. When fire swept through the crowded slums where the poorest citizens lived, the death tolls were catastrophic. You spend the night in a field outside the town walls, huddled with hundreds of other refugees, watching the glow on the horizon as your home continues to burn. The children finally sleep, exhausted by terror and loss, but you remain awake, calculating the damage. Your workshop is gone, meaning you can't work your trade. Your tools are gone, meaning you can't rebuild your workshop. Your savings, such as they were, a handful of coins hidden in a floor joist, melted in the fire or were stolen in the chaos. You have nothing except the clothes on your back and the family pressed against you for warmth. Tomorrow you'll have to start over, begging for work, begging for shelter, begging for the basic necessities of survival, assuming you can find anyone willing to help. The fire burns itself out by morning, having consumed roughly a third of the town. The stone church and a few wealthy homes built of masonry survived. Everything else in the fire's path is rubble and ash. The survivors pick through the wreckage searching for anything salvageable, but there's little to find. Iron tools have survived, their wooden handles burned away. Coins and jewellery can sometimes be recovered from the ashes, but the wooden structures, the fabric goods, the food stores, the accumulated possessions of lifetimes, all gone. The smell of smoke hangs over everything, mixing with the nauseating odour of burned flesh from those who didn't escape in time. The death toll will never be precisely known. Some victims burned beyond recognition, some were simply never found, their remains buried in collapsed buildings that no one had the resources to excavate. Some died in the immediate aftermath, succumbing to burns or smoke inhalation that initially seemed survivable. The chronicler who eventually records this fire will estimate several hundred dead. but he'll admit that the true number could be higher or lower. What matters more than the exact count is the reality of a community shattered by a disaster that was entirely preventable. If only medieval cities had been built differently, if only fire safety had been a priority, if only anyone had thought to challenge the accumulated traditions that made every town a tinderbox. You begin rebuilding in the same spot, using the same materials, following the same construction methods that made your home so vulnerable to fire in the first place. What choice do you have? Stone is expensive, available only to the wealthy. Brick is rare and difficult to produce. Timber is what you know, what your father knew, what his father knew before him. You use the charred timbers from your old home to frame the new one, a kind of phoenix rising from its own ashes, destined to burn again someday just as surely as this one did. The cycle of fire and rebuilding will continue until someone invents building codes and professional fire departments and the concept of urban planning. You won't live to see any of that. The baker whose carelessness started the fire faces no legal consequences. Perhaps he died in the blaze. No one seems certain. Perhaps he fled and is living under a new name in a distant town. Perhaps he's still here, as impoverished and traumatized as everyone else. His guilt buried under the shared catastrophe that affected everyone equally. There's no insurance to claim, no government agency to petition, no organised relief effort beyond whatever charity the church can muster. The survivors help each other because there's no one else to help them, sharing what little they have, knowing that next time it might be their homes that burn while others escape. You lay the final beam of your new roof and step back to admire your work. It looks almost exactly like the home that burned, because you built it almost exactly the same way. Thatch for the roof, timber for the frame, dried straw mixed into the walls. It will be warm in winter and cool in summer, and completely, devastatingly vulnerable to the next fire that sweeps through your neighbourhood. But you've done what you can with the resources you have, and tonight your family will sleep under a roof again. Tomorrow the baker down the street will light his oven before dawn, and the blacksmith will fire up his forge, and 1,000 candles will flicker in 1,000 windows, and somewhere, somehow, another spark will escape its bounds and start the cycle over again. You try not to think about it as you blow out your own candle and settle into sleep. Your new home stands fragile and flammable in its spot, but at least you have a roof again. The fire's devastation is slowly fading from the landscape, if not from memory, as your community rebuilds itself timber by timber. But even as you settle back into the rhythms of ordinary life, a different kind of destruction continues all around you, one so constant, so normalized, that you barely register it as unusual. The wars never stop. The raids never end. The violence that medieval people inflict upon each other is not an occasional interruption of peace, but the permanent background noise of existence. You're never truly safe, and you never will be. The local lord is feuding with his neighbour again. The cause of the dispute is unclear to you. Something about grazing rights, or a marriage alliance gone sour, or an insult delivered at a feast years ago that neither party can forget. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that armed men are riding through the countryside, burning fields and slaughtering livestock, taking whatever they want from whoever has it. Your village lies between two hostile territories, which means you're likely to be raided by both sides. Neither lord considers your welfare when planning his campaigns. You're simply terrain to be crossed, resources to be extracted, peasants to be terrorized into submission or killed as a message to the enemy. You hide in the forest when the riders come, crouching behind fallen logs with your family, listening to the distant sounds of your neighbours' screams. The soldiers take what they want: food, valuables, women, and burn what they leave behind. This is not unusual behaviour. This is simply how war works in the medieval period. The concept of civilian immunity from military violence is centuries away from being invented. You are not a protected non-combatant. You are a resource belonging to whoever controls the territory you happen to occupy. When that control is contested, you become a target by default. Historians still argue whether medieval warfare was more or less destructive than modern conflict, but the comparison misses an essential point. Medieval violence was endemic rather than episodic. Modern wars, however devastating, tend to have beginnings and endings. Medieval feudal conflict simmered continuously, occasionally boiling over into major campaigns but never truly stopping. Your grandfather fought in skirmishes with the neighbouring lord. Your father fought in the same conflict which had evolved but never resolved. Your sons will fight in it too, assuming they survive childhood. The war is not an event, it's a condition, as permanent as the weather and nearly as unavoidable. The knights who conduct these raids are theoretically bound by codes of chivalry that should limit violence against the innocent. In practice, chivalry applies primarily to the treatment of other knights, the only class of people considered worthy of honourable treatment. Peasants like you exist outside the moral circle that chivalric codes define. You can be robbed, beaten, raped, or killed without any violation of knightly honour. The elaborate rituals of ransom and courtesy that govern warfare among nobles do not extend to commoners. When a knight rides through your village, you are not a person entitled to respect. You are an obstacle or an opportunity, depending on what he wants. You emerge from the forest after the raiders have moved on, surveying the damage. Your neighbour's cottage is burning. His chickens have been taken or killed. His daughter is nowhere to be found, and you don't ask questions because you already know the answer. The well has been fouled with animal carcasses, a common tactic to deny resources to the enemy. Never mind that the enemy in this case is simply peasants trying to survive. You begin the work of cleaning up, knowing that this will happen again, perhaps next month, perhaps next week, perhaps tomorrow. The only uncertainty is timing. The larger campaigns are even worse. When great lords muster their armies for major expeditions, the countryside through which they march is stripped bare. Thousands of soldiers need food, and requisitioning from local populations is far easier than maintaining complex supply lines. The army takes everything: grain, livestock, horses, carts, even the peasants themselves, pressed into service as labourers or camp followers. The passage of a medieval army was a catastrophe comparable to plague or famine, leaving behind a swath of destruction that took years to recover from. Towns along major invasion routes were devastated repeatedly, their populations killed or scattered, their economies shattered, their futures erased. The 100 Years' War between England and France, spanning from 1337 to 1453, exemplified the devastating potential of prolonged medieval conflict. For over a century, armies marched back and forth across France, fighting pitched battles occasionally, but spending far more time raiding, pillaging, and terrorising civilian populations. The chevauchée, a mounted raid designed specifically to destroy enemy territory, was a standard tactic, employed deliberately and systematically to break the economic and psychological capacity of the opposing side. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, livestock was slaughtered, and peasants were killed or driven off their land. The population of France may have declined by half over the course of the war, with violence, famine, and disease all playing their interrelated roles. You listen to travellers who pass through your village, telling stories of the Great War in France. They describe atrocities that seem almost unbelievable: whole towns massacred, prisoners executed en masse, countryside reduced to wilderness where wolves reclaim abandoned fields. But you don't find the stories unbelievable at all. You've seen the same things on a smaller scale, right here in your own territory. The difference is merely one of magnitude. A local lord can destroy a dozen villages, a king can destroy thousands. The principle remains the same: armed men taking what they want from those too weak to stop them. The mercenary companies are perhaps the worst of all. Professional soldiers who fight for pay rather than loyalty. They often find themselves unemployed between campaigns, with no source of income except what they can extract from civilian populations. These free companies roamed medieval Europe like plagues of locusts, occupying territories, demanding tribute, and punishing anyone who resisted. Some grew powerful enough to threaten kings and emperors. All of them survived by preying on people like you, people without weapons or walls or any defense against organized violence. When a mercenary company appeared on the horizon, you ran if you could and paid if you couldn't, knowing that resistance meant death. The psychological impact of this constant violence is difficult to overstate. You live in a state of permanent low-grade fear, never certain when the next raid will come, never confident that tomorrow will be safe. Every stranger on the road might be a scout for an approaching army. Every dispute among nobles might escalate into warfare that sweeps through your village. You develop a fatalism that borders on despair. What's the point of accumulating wealth or building for the future when everything can be taken or destroyed at any moment? This fatalism shapes medieval culture in profound ways, reinforcing religious focus on the afterlife over earthly concerns, discouraging investment and innovation, keeping populations trapped in cycles of poverty and vulnerability. You teach your children what your parents taught you, how to hide, how to run, how to recognize the signs of approaching danger. You show them the best routes into the forest, the deepest thickets where horses can't follow, the streams where you can wade to hide your tracks. These are survival skills more important than any trade, knowledge passed down through generations of peasants who learned from bitter experience what happens when armed men arrive and find you unprepared. Your children absorb these lessons with the gravity they deserve, understanding already that their world is a dangerous place where the strong take and the weak suffer. The night falls quiet tonight. No hoofbeats on the road, no distant glow of burning fields. You allow yourself a moment of peace, knowing it's temporary. Tomorrow or next week or next month the violence will return. It always does. The feuds between lords will continue until one side is destroyed or both are exhausted. The great wars between kingdoms will grind on for generations. The mercenary companies will roam until someone pays them to fight or kills them trying. And through it all, people like you will hide in forests, bury their dead, rebuild their homes, and wonder if this is really all that human existence has to offer. The answer, for most of medieval history, is yes. This is the world. This is what normal looks like, and tomorrow you'll wake up and try to survive it all over again. The local wars continue their grinding destruction, but now word reaches your village of something far worse approaching from the east. Rumours have been circulating for months, tales of an unstoppable horde sweeping across the steppes, destroying everything in its path, leaving pyramids of skulls to mark its passage. You dismissed these stories as exaggeration at first. Every generation has its tales of distant terrors. But the refugees now streaming westward tell consistent stories, their eyes haunted by things they've witnessed. The Mongols are coming, and they're bringing a new weapon that will revolutionize warfare in the most horrifying way imaginable. The year is 1346, and you find yourself near the Black Sea port of Kaffa, where a Mongol army under the command of Jani Beg has laid siege to the Genoese trading colony. The siege has dragged on for months, and the Mongol forces are dying in disturbing numbers, not from combat but from a disease that produces terrible swellings and kills within days. You recognise the symptoms from the stories that have preceded the Mongol advance. The plague has caught up with the conquerors, and it's devastating their ranks. But what happens next will change the course of history in ways no one present can possibly imagine. The Mongol commanders, frustrated by the disease decimating their army and the stubbornness of the Genoese defenders, devise a new tactic. They load the bodies of plague victims onto their catapults and hurl them over the city walls. The decomposing corpses arc through the air and crash into the streets and buildings of Kaffa, spreading their contamination wherever they land. The stench is unbearable. The panic is absolute. The Genoese, trapped within their walls with rotting plague victims literally falling from the sky, begin to sicken and die in enormous numbers. This is biological warfare, perhaps the first recorded use of disease as a deliberate weapon, and it works with terrifying effectiveness. Historians still argue whether the catapulted corpses actually transmitted the plague to Kaffa's population, or whether the disease would have spread regardless through rat and flea vectors. The biology is complicated. Plague bacteria don't survive long in dead bodies, and transmission typically requires flea bites or direct contact with infected bodily fluids. But the psychological impact was undeniable. The Genoese, already terrified of the mysterious disease ravaging the Mongol camp, found themselves bombarded with its victims, surrounded by death in its most grotesque form. When ships finally fled the besieged city, carrying survivors back to Sicily and other Mediterranean ports, they carried the plague with them. Remember those death ships arriving at Messina that we discussed at the beginning of our journey? This is where they came from. The Mongol approach to warfare was already legendary for its brutality, but the siege of Kaffa added a new dimension to their fearsome reputation. The empire founded by Genghis Khan had conquered more territory than any power in history, sweeping across Asia and into Europe with a speed and violence that seemed supernatural to those who faced it. Cities that resisted were destroyed utterly, their populations massacred to the last child, their buildings razed to the ground, their very names erased from memory. Cities that surrendered were treated more mercifully, but mercy was relative. Tribute was extracted, hostages were taken, and any sign of future resistance was met with annihilation. You hear the accounts from survivors who witnessed Mongol conquest firsthand, and their stories defy belief. The destruction of Khwarezmia, where millions died, and irrigation systems that had supported civilization for millennia were deliberately destroyed. The sack of Baghdad, where the Tigris ran red with blood and the greatest library in the Islamic world was thrown into the river. The pyramids of skulls that marked conquered cities, some reportedly containing tens of thousands of heads stacked as monuments to Mongol power. The scale of death inflicted by the Mongol conquests may have exceeded 50 million people, a significant percentage of the world's population at the time. This was extinction-level violence, systematic and deliberate, designed to terrify surviving populations into absolute submission. The biological dimension of Mongol conquest extended beyond the deliberate use of plague corpses at Kaffa. The Mongol armies themselves served as vectors for disease transmission, carrying pathogens across continents as they moved along trade routes and invasion paths. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability under Mongol rule that facilitated trade across Eurasia, also facilitated the spread of diseases that had previously been confined to regional populations. Bubonic plague, which had lurked in rodent populations of Central Asia for centuries, rode the Mongol highways westward, finding new populations with no immunity, no understanding, no defence. You watch the refugees from the east struggle into your village, gaunt and desperate, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of everything they've lost. They speak of cities that no longer exist, of families slaughtered before their eyes, of a terror so absolute that death seemed preferable to capture. Some bear the scars of violence, missing limbs, blinded eyes, brands marking them as former slaves who somehow escaped. Others seem physically intact but clearly shattered in some deeper way, their spirits broken by experiences too terrible to process. They beg for food, for shelter, for any scrap of human kindness in a world that has shown them only cruelty. The Mongol threat eventually receded from Europe, turned back partly by internal conflicts within the empire, and partly by the geographical limits of steppe cavalry warfare. The forests and mountains of Central Europe proved less hospitable to Mongol tactics than the open plains where their horsemanship gave them decisive advantage. But the diseases they had helped spread continued their westward march, indifferent to military setbacks. The plague that Janibeg's forces hurled over the walls of Kaffa would go on to kill more Europeans than all the Mongol armies combined could ever have slaughtered directly. The biological weapon proved more devastating than the warriors who deployed it. The psychological impact of the Mongol invasions persisted for centuries. European consciousness was marked by the memory of this threat from the east, this seemingly unstoppable force that had nearly swept away Christendom entirely. The fear of invasion from the steppes became embedded in cultural memory, influencing politics and military strategy for generations. The knowledge that such destruction was possible, that entire civilizations could be erased, that populations could be exterminated wholesale, that the accumulated achievements of centuries could be destroyed in weeks, shaped a worldview already darkened by plague and famine and endless local warfare. You help the refugees as best you can, sharing food you can barely spare, offering space in your rebuilt home that's already too crowded. Their stories keep you awake at night, imagining what it would be like to watch your own city burn, your own family die, your own world collapse into ashen memory. The Mongols didn't reach your village, didn't even come close, but the knowledge of what they did elsewhere is enough to haunt you. The plague they helped spread will eventually arrive here too, carried by rats and fleas along the same trade routes that once seemed to promise prosperity. The weapon launched at Kaffa will keep killing long after the siege is forgotten, long after the Mongol Empire has crumbled, long after everyone who witnessed those corpses flying through the air has joined them in death. The connection between warfare and disease, so grimly illustrated at Kaffa, would persist throughout medieval history and beyond. Armies were always accompanied by epidemics, the close quarters and poor sanitation of military camps creating perfect conditions for pathogen transmission. Siege warfare was particularly deadly, trapping populations in enclosed spaces where disease could spread unchecked, while starvation weakened immune systems. The towns that survived direct assault often succumbed to the pestilence that followed. War and plague danced together across medieval Europe, each enabling the other, each amplifying the other's devastation. You stand at the edge of your village, looking east toward lands you've never seen and now never want to see. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the ruins of destroyed cities still smoulder. Somewhere out there, the bones of millions lie unburied, picked clean by crows and wild dogs. Somewhere out there, the plague continues its slow march westward, jumping from rodent to rodent, flea to flea, human to human, following trade routes and refugee trails toward your home. The Mongols launched their terrible weapon years ago and thousands of miles away, but its effects are still spreading, still killing, still shaping the future of a world that doesn't yet understand what's coming. You turn back toward your village and try to live another ordinary day, knowing that nothing about this world is ordinary at all. The Mongol threat has receded into memory and nightmare, but the plague they helped unleash continues its work, killing and killing and killing until it seems impossible that anyone will remain. And in the midst of all this dying, the authorities who should be protecting you have found someone to blame. Not the rats, not the fleas, not the Mongol armies who catapulted corpses over city walls. The blame falls instead on your neighbours, the Jews, the heretics, the outsiders, anyone who can be sacrificed to explain why God has abandoned his people. The persecutions that follow will depopulate entire regions as effectively as any plague. You watch the soldiers march into the Jewish quarter of the nearest town, their torches already lit. The accusations have been circulating for weeks. The Jews poisoned the wells. The Jews caused the plague. The Jews are in league with Satan himself to destroy Christendom. Never mind that Jews are dying of plague in the same numbers as everyone else. Never mind that they drink from the same wells they're accused of poisoning. Never mind that the accusations make no logical sense whatsoever. Logic has no power in a world gone mad with grief and terror. Someone must be responsible. Someone must pay. And the Jews, always outsiders, always vulnerable, always convenient scapegoats, become the targets of a violence that will kill tens of thousands. The Strasbourg massacre of 1349 burns 2,000 Jews alive on a massive wooden platform, constructed specifically for the purpose. The entire Jewish community is rounded up, given the choice between baptism and death, and those who refuse conversion are led to the burning platform and set ablaze. Their property is seized and distributed among the Christian population, their debts to Jewish moneylenders conveniently cancelled, their homes and businesses taken over by their killers. The massacre is not a spontaneous outburst of mob violence, but an organised official action, sanctioned by city authorities who see an opportunity to solve their debt problems while appearing to address the plague crisis. Similar scenes play out across Germany, France, and beyond. Historians still argue about the precise death toll of the anti-Jewish violence during the Black Death years, but estimates suggest that hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed and tens of thousands of people killed. In some regions, the Jewish population was essentially eliminated, survivors fleeing eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered them protection, partly out of genuine tolerance, partly out of economic calculation about the value of Jewish merchants and craftsmen. The geographic distribution of Jewish populations in later centuries was shaped significantly by this wave of persecution, as survivors resettled in areas that had not participated in the massacres. The Jews were not the only targets. The flagellants we discussed earlier often directed violence against Jewish communities, their bloody processions becoming pretexts for pogrom. But heretics of all kinds faced similar dangers. The Cathars of southern France had already been largely exterminated in the Albigensian Crusade of the early 13th century, their distinctive Christian beliefs declared heretical, and their followers hunted, killed, and burned across decades of religious warfare. Entire cities were put to the sword. When asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics during the sack of Béziers, a papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether or not the quote is authentic, the sentiment was real. 20,000 people died that day, heretic and orthodox alike. You keep your head down and your opinions to yourself. In a world where wrong belief can mean death by fire, orthodoxy is survival strategy. You attend Mass regularly, confess your sins to the priest, and never ever express any thoughts that might be construed as heretical. Your neighbour wasn't so careful. He asked questions about church doctrine, wondered aloud about certain inconsistencies in official teaching, speculated about matters that were supposed to be settled. Someone reported him. The Inquisition came. You saw him led away in chains, and you never saw him again. The smoke rising from the town square a week later told you all you needed to know about his fate. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century to combat heresy, became a formidable mechanism for identifying, trying, and executing those whose beliefs deviated from official church teaching. Its procedures, while more orderly than mob violence, were hardly models of justice. torture was authorized to extract confessions. The accused often faced their accusers without knowing who they were or what specific charges had been brought. Property was confiscated, creating financial incentives for accusations. The definition of heresy was broad and flexible, capable of encompassing almost any deviation from orthodoxy, any inconvenient belief, any personal enemy someone wanted eliminated. The persecution extended beyond religious minorities to include supposed witches, whose numbers would swell dramatically in later centuries, but who already faced execution during the medieval period. Old women living alone, healers whose remedies seemed too effective, anyone who attracted suspicion for any reason might find themselves accused of trafficking with demons. The accused witches were almost always the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, the socially marginal, people without powerful protectors who could be sacrificed without consequence. The trials that condemned them relied on evidence that would be laughable if the consequences weren't so tragic. Spectral testimony, confessions extracted through torture, the discovery of supposed witch marks that were often simply moles or birthmarks. You remember the old woman who lived at the edge of your village, the one who knew which herbs could ease a fever and which roots could help a difficult pregnancy. She was accused after a neighbour's cow died unexpectedly. The neighbour claimed she had cursed the animal. Others came forward with their own accusations: children who had fallen ill, crops that had failed, livestock that had behaved strangely. Each misfortune was attributed to the old woman's malevolence. She was taken, questioned, tortured, until she confessed to crimes she had never committed, and burned before a crowd that included people she had helped, people whose lives she had saved. You watched her die and said nothing, because saying something would have meant joining her on the pyre. The mass executions served multiple purposes beyond their ostensible goal of purifying society. They provided catharsis for populations overwhelmed by suffering they couldn't understand or control. They eliminated inconvenient people, creditors, rivals, eccentrics, under cover of religious duty. They reinforced the authority of church and state by demonstrating their power over life and death. And they distracted attention from the actual causes of plague and famine, directing anger toward scapegoats rather than toward the systems and conditions that made disaster inevitable. The Jews didn't cause the plague, but blaming them was easier than confronting the reality that no one understood what was happening or how to stop it. The violence created its own refugees, streams of survivors fleeing persecution and carrying their trauma to new lands. Jewish communities that had existed for generations disappeared overnight, their members killed or scattered, their synagogues burned, their cemeteries desecrated. Survivors faced the choice of conversion, sincere or feigned, or flight to regions where they might find toleration. The cultural and economic losses were immense, as skilled craftsmen, learned scholars, and established merchants were killed or driven away. The communities that perpetrated these massacres often found themselves impoverished afterward, having destroyed the very people who had contributed most to their prosperity. You grow older in a world shaped by persecution, where difference is danger and conformity is survival. You teach your children to believe what they're told, to never question authority, to keep their thoughts hidden behind masks of orthodoxy. The lessons of the burnings have been learned. The cost of deviation has been demonstrated. You worship as you're instructed, think as you're permitted, and live within the narrow boundaries that power has defined. The alternative is unthinkable, or rather, thinking the alternative is precisely what gets people killed. You've seen enough death. You've watched enough neighbours led to pyres. You want only to survive, to see your children grow, to die in your bed rather than in flames. The persecutions eventually subside, not because tolerance triumphs, but because the immediate crises that triggered them pass. The plague recedes, the flagellant movements fade, the hysteria gives way to exhaustion. But the mechanisms of persecution remain in place, ready to be activated again whenever fear and suffering create the need for scapegoats. The Jews who survive face periodic outbursts of violence for centuries to come. The Inquisition continues its work. The witch trials are only getting started, with the worst still centuries in the future. The lesson of the Black Death persecutions is clear. When people are frightened enough, when suffering becomes unbearable enough, they will kill their neighbours rather than accept that some catastrophes have no human cause and no human solution. The persecutions have claimed their victims, the pyres have burned down to ash, and the survivors carry on in a world that seems determined to kill them by any means available. But even in times of relative peace, when plague is dormant and war is elsewhere and the Inquisition has turned its attention to other targets, something is slowly, silently destroying you from within. You don't feel sick exactly. You feel tired. Your bones ache. Your gums bleed when you eat. Your old wounds refuse to heal properly. You're falling apart in small ways that don't seem connected but share a common cause. You're starving to death, even when your belly is full. The food you eat is killing you through what it lacks. Your diet consists almost entirely of bread. Dark, heavy, coarse bread made from rye or barley, occasionally from wheat if you're fortunate. You eat bread for breakfast, bread for lunch, bread for dinner. Sometimes you have pottage, a thin soup of whatever vegetables or legumes are available, but the base of every meal is bread. Meat is rare, reserved for feast days or available only to the wealthy. Fresh fruits and vegetables are seasonal luxuries, unavailable for most of the year. Dairy products are more common, but still not daily fare for most peasants. Your body runs on carbohydrates processed from grain, and almost nothing else. This monotonous diet leaves you deficient in virtually every essential nutrient. Vitamin C is almost entirely absent during winter months, when no fresh produce is available. The result is scurvy, that disease of sailors we associate with long sea voyages, but that actually affected landbound populations throughout the medieval period. Your gums swell and bleed, your teeth loosen and fall out, your skin develops strange bruises that seem to appear from nowhere. Old wounds reopen as the collagen that holds your tissues together breaks down. Left untreated, scurvy is fatal, and the only treatment, fresh fruits and vegetables, is precisely what your diet lacks. Historians still argue about the prevalence of vitamin deficiency diseases in medieval populations, partly because the symptoms overlap with other conditions and chroniclers rarely distinguish between them. But the dietary evidence is clear. Most medieval Europeans subsisted on nutritionally inadequate diets that would produce deficiency diseases in modern populations. The mystery is not whether these conditions existed, but how anyone survived them. The answer is that many didn't, and those who did often lived with chronic symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as preventable nutritional disorders. Rickets afflicts the children around you, their bones softening from lack of vitamin D. You see it in their bowed legs, their protruding bellies, their slow growth and frequent fractures. Vitamin D is synthesized in the skin through sun exposure, but medieval children spend much of their time indoors, working in dimly lit cottages or confined during the long dark winters when sunlight is scarce. The fish that might provide dietary vitamin D is unavailable to inland populations. The dairy products that could help are inconsistently available. The children grow up stunted and deformed, their skeletons permanently marked by the deprivations of their early years. Pellagra haunts communities that rely too heavily on corn, though this will become more common after the Columbian Exchange brings maize to Europe. The disease produces the distinctive 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. Similar symptoms can arise from other nutritional deficiencies, and medieval Europeans experienced their share of skin conditions, intestinal disorders, and mental deterioration that may have stemmed from inadequate diets. The connection between food and health was poorly understood. Galenic medicine attributed most illness to humoral imbalance rather than nutritional deficiency. So people suffered and died from conditions that could have been prevented by simply eating differently. You look at your own hands and see the signs of malnutrition written on your body. Your nails are brittle and ridged, your skin is dry and rough, your hair has lost its luster and falls out in clumps. These are the visible symptoms of deficiencies invisible to medieval understanding. You're not getting enough iron, so you're chronically anemic, tired and weak even after adequate rest. You're not getting enough zinc, so your immune system functions poorly, leaving you vulnerable to every passing infection. You're not getting enough of a dozen essential nutrients, and the cumulative effect is a body that functions at a fraction of its potential, aging faster than it should, breaking down in ways that seem like simple bad luck, but actually stem from systematic nutritional failure. The wealthy fare somewhat better, with access to more varied diets that include meat, fresh produce, and imported delicacies. But even aristocratic tables are deficient by modern standards, heavy on preserved meats and light on fresh vegetables, dependent on spices that mask spoilage rather than prevent it. The wealthy suffer their own nutritional disorders, gout from excessive meat consumption, obesity from caloric surplus without corresponding exercise, tooth decay from sweetened foods. Money cannot buy nutritional knowledge that doesn't exist, and the elaborate banquets of the medieval nobility are often as unhealthy in their excess as peasant meals are in their deficiency. The seasonal variation in diet makes everything worse. Spring and summer bring fresh vegetables and fruits, briefly correcting the vitamin deficiencies accumulated over winter. But autumn and winter return you to the endless bread, the preserved foods that have lost whatever nutritional value they once possessed, the stale monotony that slowly drains your body of essential compounds. You learn to dread winter not just for its cold, but for its dietary poverty, knowing that by spring your body will be struggling to function on reserves long since depleted. The first fresh greens of spring feel miraculous, not just psychologically, but physiologically, your scurvy-weakened tissues absorbing vitamin C like a sponge absorbing water. The children suffer most because their growing bodies need nutrients that simply aren't available. A child who survives infancy, and many don't, faces years of inadequate nutrition during the critical period when bones and brains are developing. The stunted growth, the developmental delays, the cognitive impairments that result are invisible to medieval observers who assume that children are simply smaller and less capable than adults rather than recognizing that malnutrition has permanently limited their potential. The survivors carry these limitations into adulthood, never knowing what they might have become if they'd been properly fed. You watch your own children and worry about what their diet is doing to them. They're thin and small, prone to illnesses that linger too long, slow to heal from every scrape and cut. You feed them as well as you can, but as well as you can means bread and more bread, pottage when vegetables are available, meat on the rare occasions when you can afford it. It's not enough. You know it's not enough, even without understanding exactly why. Some intuition tells you that your children need more than what you're providing, but more simply isn't available. The structural limitations of medieval agriculture, food preservation, and distribution ensure that most people will never have access to nutritionally adequate diets. The irony is bitter. In a world where famine periodically kills thousands outright, the survivors are still being killed by their food, more slowly, but just as surely. The grain that keeps you alive also keeps you sick. The diet that prevents immediate starvation produces chronic deficiency diseases that weaken you for every other threat you face. When plague arrives, it finds bodies already compromised by malnutrition. When injury occurs, it finds tissues unable to heal properly. When age advances, it finds systems worn out decades before their time. The food you eat is better than no food at all, but only barely, and the margin by which it sustains life is narrow indeed. You finish your evening bread, chewing slowly to make it last, feeling your loose teeth shift in your bleeding gums. Tomorrow you'll eat more bread, and the day after, and every day until something changes or something kills you. The monotony is soul-crushing, but also comforting in its predictability. At least you have bread. At least you're not among those who have nothing at all. You lie down to sleep, your malnourished body aching in ways you've learned to ignore, and you dream of foods you've never tasted, fruits and meats and delicacies that exist only in stories told by travellers from distant lands. When you wake, there will be bread waiting, and you'll eat it gratefully because the alternative is so much worse. Your malnourished body aches as you rise for another day, but at least you slept indoors, away from the animals that provide your livelihood. Or did you? The truth is, in countless medieval households, the line between human dwelling and animal shelter barely exists. You share your living space with chickens that roost in corners, pigs that wander through the main room, cattle that occupy one end of the longhouse while you occupy the other. The warmth of their bodies helps heat your home during winter months. Their proximity also ensures that every disease they carry has ample opportunity to jump into your bloodstream. The cow that shares your cottage coughs wetly in the night, a sound so familiar you barely register it anymore. What you don't know is that the bacterium causing that cough, Mycobacterium bovis, bovine tuberculosis, is perfectly capable of infecting humans. Every time you milk that cow, every time you drink the unpasteurized milk or eat the cheese made from it, every time you breathe the same air in your shared living space, you risk infection. Tuberculosis will become one of the great killers of human history, and a significant portion of medieval cases originated in the cattle that people lived alongside so intimately. The relationship between humans and their animals in the medieval period was far closer than anything modern people experience outside of farming communities. Animals weren't just economic assets kept at a sanitary distance. They were household members whose presence was constant and unavoidable. Peasant families often slept in the same room where animals were stabled, separated only by a low partition or nothing at all. The practice made sense from practical standpoints. Animal body heat provided warmth, proximity allowed for protection against theft, and small homes couldn't accommodate separate structures. But the epidemiological consequences were severe. Historians still argue about the relative contribution of bovine versus human strains to medieval tuberculosis mortality, but the evidence suggests both played significant roles. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries frequently show the characteristic lesions of spinal tuberculosis, indicating that the disease was widespread across all social classes. The wealthy, who could afford more meat and dairy, may actually have faced higher exposure to bovine tuberculosis, while the poor faced higher rates of human-to-human transmission in their crowded living conditions. Either way, the White Plague, as tuberculosis was sometimes called, claimed countless lives across the medieval centuries. You watch the pig rooting through the rushes on your floor, snuffling up the scraps and debris that accumulate between cleanings. Pigs are valuable, efficient converters of garbage into meat, and your family couldn't survive without them. But pigs also carry diseases that transfer readily to humans. Trichinosis lurks in undercooked pork, the parasitic worms encysting in muscle tissue and causing symptoms ranging from mild discomfort to death. Swine influenza strains can jump to human hosts, potentially combining with human strains to produce novel variants. The pig that seems like a source of prosperity is also a source of pathogens, a living disease reservoir snuffling contentedly through your home. The chickens present their own hazards. Avian diseases occasionally make the leap to human hosts, though the great influenza pandemics lie in the future. More immediately, the birds contaminate everything they touch with feces carrying salmonella and other enteric pathogens. The eggs you collect are coated with bacteria. The surfaces where chickens walk are contaminated. The very air of your home carries particles of dried chicken waste that you breathe constantly. Every meal prepared in your cottage is prepared in an environment that would fail any modern health inspection spectacularly. Anthrax, the great fear of livestock keepers, strikes without warning. A healthy animal sickens and dies within hours, its blood thick with bacteria. Anyone who handles the carcass, butchers the meat, or processes the hide risks infection through cuts in the skin or inhalation of spores. The cutaneous form produces the characteristic blackishar that gives the disease its name. The pulmonary form is almost invariably fatal. You've seen it happen. A neighbour who found his sheep dead in the morning and was dead himself by nightfall, the disease moving through his body with terrifying speed. The sheep were burned, the field was abandoned, and everyone prayed the infection wouldn't spread further. The murrain, a catch-all medieval term for animal epidemics, struck periodically, killing livestock in numbers that devastated agricultural economies. The Great Cattle Plague of the 1310s and 1320s killed perhaps 80% of cattle in some regions, eliminating not just meat and dairy, but also the draft animals needed for ploughing. These animal diseases didn't always jump to humans, but when they did, the results were catastrophic. And even when the diseases stayed in their animal hosts, the agricultural collapse that followed created famines that killed humans indirectly. Remember the Great Famine we discussed earlier? The murrain was a crucial contributing factor, destroying the livestock that communities depended upon. You tend to your animals with care, not understanding exactly what you risk, but sensing that sick animals mean danger. Folk wisdom has accumulated over generations, teaching that certain symptoms warrant caution, that dead animals should be handled carefully, that milk from sick cows shouldn't be consumed. This wisdom provides some protection, but it's incomplete and often wrong. The invisible world of pathogens remains invisible, its workings mysterious, its assaults unpredictable. You follow the precautions you've been taught and hope they're sufficient, knowing in your bones that hope is often all you have. The horses and donkeys that wealthier households maintain carry their own diseases, including glanders, a bacterial infection that spreads from equines to humans through direct contact with infected animals or contaminated materials. Stable workers and cavalry soldiers were particularly vulnerable, developing the respiratory or cutaneous forms of a disease that was frequently fatal. The close relationship between medieval society and its horses essential for transportation, agriculture and warfare, ensured that glanders remained endemic, killing steadily, if not spectacularly, throughout the period. Dogs and cats shared human homes and brought their own parasites and pathogens. The dog sleeping by your fire carries fleas that could transmit plague, though the rat flea is the primary vector. More commonly, dogs transmit roundworms and other intestinal parasites to the children who play with them, contributing to the burden of chronic illness that weakens young bodies. Cats, as we'll discuss later, were sometimes killed as demonic familiars, but when they were allowed to live, they too contributed their parasites to the household disease ecology. Every companion animal was also a potential disease vector. The cumulative effect of living so intimately with animals was a constant low-level assault on human health. Respiratory infections passed back and forth between species. Intestinal parasites cycled through human and animal hosts. Skin conditions spread through direct contact. Bacterial and viral diseases occasionally made the leap from one species to another, sometimes with devastating results. Modern public health depends fundamentally on separation. Animals kept apart from food preparation, livestock housed away from human dwellings, hygiene barriers maintained between species. Medieval life had none of these protections. You lived with your animals, breathed their air, touched their bodies, consumed their products, and absorbed whatever diseases they carried. You finish your evening chores, feeding the chickens, checking on the cow, making sure the pig has water. These animals are your wealth, your security, your hedge against starvation. Without them, you couldn't survive. With them, you barely survive, your health constantly undermined by the pathogens they share with you. It's a bargain with no alternative, a deal you can't refuse and can't renegotiate. The animals stay in your home because there's nowhere else for them to go, and you stay in your home because there's nowhere else for you to go, and together you share everything. Warmth, food, shelter, and disease. Tomorrow the cow will cough again, and you'll think nothing of it, and the bacteria will continue their invisible work, and the great wheel of zoonotic disease will keep turning. The animals cough and snuffle through another night, and you wake to the familiar aches of your malnourished, parasite-ridden body. But today is different. Today you're not heading to the fields or the market. Today you're descending into the earth itself, joining the crews that work the silver mines, in the hills beyond your village. The pay is better than anything farming offers. The work is also more likely to kill you than almost any other occupation in the medieval world. The mines are waiting, dark and hungry, and they consume workers the way a furnace consumes fuel. The entrance to the mine is a rough-hewn hole in the hillside, timbers framing an opening that seems to swallow light itself. You've heard the stories from men who work the depths, stories of tunnels that collapse without warning, of air that turns poisonous, of water that floods shafts faster than pumps can clear it. Some men go down in the morning and never come up. Some come up changed, their lungs destroyed, their bodies poisoned, their remaining years numbered in months rather than decades. You take a breath of clean air, knowing it may be one of the last truly clean breaths you ever take, and you step into the darkness. The mines of medieval Europe were engineering marvels and death traps in equal measure. Silver, lead, copper, iron, tin. The metals that drove medieval economies required extraction from deep underground, and the technology for safe extraction simply didn't exist. Ventilation was primitive, relying on natural air currents supplemented by fires at shaft bottoms that theoretically drew fresh air down through separate passages. In practice, the air in working tunnels was often so foul that candles wouldn't burn and workers couldn't breathe. The gases that accumulated, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide, killed silently and quickly. You crawl through tunnels so narrow that your shoulders scrape both walls so low that you can't lift your head. The rock presses in from all sides, and the weight of the earth above you is a physical presence, millions of tons held back by wooden supports that creak and groan with every movement. The candle in your hand provides the only light, and its flame flickers ominously, warning of bad air ahead. You've learned to watch the flame. If it dims, you retreat. If it goes out, you pray you can find your way back before the darkness becomes permanent. Historians still argue about mortality rates in medieval mines, partly because record-keeping was inconsistent, and partly because deaths often occurred slowly, from diseases that manifested long after workers left the mines. But contemporary accounts make clear that mining was understood as a death sentence. Georgius Agricola, writing in the 16th century about practices that had changed little from medieval times, described how miners rarely survived past middle age, their lungs destroyed by dust, their bodies poisoned by the metals they extracted. Widows and orphans were so common in mining communities that special provisions had to be made for their support. The lead mines are the worst. The ore you extract is heavy with the metal that we've already discussed in the context of cosmetics and medicine, and here the exposure is far more intense. You breathe lead dust with every swing of your pick. It coats your skin, your hair, your clothing. You eat your meals underground with hands covered in lead residue, ingesting the poison with every bite. The symptoms develop gradually. The tremors, the stomach pains, the confusion, the paralysis. But they develop inevitably. Every miner knows someone who shook so badly they couldn't hold a tool, someone whose mind wandered into permanent fog, someone who simply collapsed one day and never recovered. The silver mines bring their own toxic burden. Silver ore is typically found mixed with lead and arsenic compounds, meaning that extracting precious metal also means extracting poison. The smelting process releases toxic fumes that settle over mining communities like a permanent fog. Vegetation dies for miles around successful mines. Animals sicken. Children born in mining towns show higher rates of deformity and developmental delay. The wealth that flows from the mines comes at a cost measured in shortened lives and ruined health. A transaction that medieval society considers acceptable because someone must extract the metal, and it won't be the wealthy. You work your shift in conditions that would be illegal in any modern jurisdiction. The heat from the earth increases with depth, and deep tunnels become suffocatingly hot. Water seeps from every surface, requiring constant pumping that sometimes falls behind, flooding the lowest levels and drowning workers who can't escape quickly enough. The rock itself is unstable, prone to sudden collapses that bury workers under tons of debris. Rescue attempts are rare and rarely successful. When a tunnel collapses, the trapped workers usually die where they lie, their bodies sometimes recovered weeks later, sometimes entombed forever. The dust is omnipresent and inescapable. Every blow of the hammer, every swing of the pick, every movement of ore from face to shaft releases particles into the air. You breathe this dust constantly, feeling it coat your throat and settle into your lungs. The coughing starts within months of beginning mine work, a dry, persistent cough that never quite goes away. Over years, the cough becomes productive, bringing up black phlegm filled with rock particles. Your breathing grows laboured, your endurance diminishes, your body struggles to extract oxygen from air through lungs increasingly scurrit with mineral deposits. This is silicosis, the miner's disease, and it kills as surely as any plague, just more slowly. The accidents are almost a mercy compared to the slow deaths from occupational disease. A tunnel collapse kills in seconds. A fall down a shaft ends with a single impact. Even drowning in a flooded tunnel is over in minutes. But the diseases, the lead poisoning, the arsite exposure, the silicosis, these take years, stripping away health incrementally, turning strong workers into invalids who can neither work nor truly rest. You see them in the mining villages, the former workers who shuffle through their remaining days, coughing and trembling, waiting for deaths that seem to take forever to arrive. You emerge from the mine as the sun sets, blinking in light that seems impossibly bright after hours in candlelit darkness. Your body aches from the cramped positions, your lungs burn from the dust, your hands are raw from the tools. The pay is indeed better than farming, but you understand now why farmers stay in their fields despite the poverty. Every coin you earn underground is purchased with a fraction of your remaining lifespan. The calculation is grimly simple. Work the mines and die young, but leave something for your family, or work the fields and live longer in poverty. Neither option offers escape. The mining towns themselves are grim places, populated by workers and widows, marked by the detritus of extraction, slag heaps, polluted streams, barren hillsides stripped of vegetation. The wealthy investors who profit from the mines live elsewhere, far from the contamination they create, their silver coins untouched by the lead dust that coated the hands that mined them. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval mining. The wealth it generates flows upward to people who never descend into the darkness, while the costs, measured in shortened lives and broken bodies, are borne entirely by those who have no other options. You wash the worst of the dust from your hands and face, but you can taste it in your mouth, feel it in your lungs, sense it circulating through your bloodstream toward the organs it will eventually destroy. Tomorrow you'll descend again, because the alternative is starvation, because your family needs the coins you earn, because the medieval economy runs on metal extracted by workers who are themselves consumed in the process. The mines are hungry, and they'll keep feeding until your body has nothing left to give. You eat your evening meal with trembling hands. Is that just fatigue, or something worse? And you try not to calculate how many more trips into the darkness you have left before the darkness claims you permanently. You emerge from the mines one final time, your lungs too damaged to continue, your hands too unsteady to swing a pick. The mining life is over for you, and whatever years remain will be spent watching your body continue its slow decline. But as you sit in the fading light, coughing up the remnants of your underground years, you find yourself thinking about something a traveller told you recently. A story about a plague that struck long before your time, long before even your great-grandparents' time, a catastrophe so immense that it nearly ended civilization itself. The Black Death that swept through your century was devastating, but it was not the first time such a horror had visited the world. The plague of Justinian, striking nearly 8 centuries earlier, came even closer to extinguishing humanity altogether. The year was 541 AD, and the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justinian I was at the height of its power. Constantinople was the greatest city in the world, heir to Rome's glory, centre of trade and learning and religious authority. The empire stretched from Spain to Persia, and Justinian dreamed of restoring the full grandeur of ancient Rome. Those dreams would die, along with perhaps half the world's population, when ships from Egypt arrived in the capital carrying grain, and rats, and fleas, and the bacterium Yersinia pestis making its first recorded appearance in human history. The plague struck Constantinople with a ferocity that defied comprehension. At its peak, the disease was killing 10,000 people per day in the capital alone. The dead accumulated faster than the living could bury them, piling up in the streets, in homes, in public buildings, until the stench of decay hung over the city like a permanent fog. Justinian himself fell ill but survived, one of the minority who escaped the plague's grip. His empire did not fare so well. The tax base collapsed as populations died. The army shrank as soldiers succumbed. The dreams of reconquest died with the workers and warriors who might have achieved them. Historians still argue about the total death toll of the Justinian plague, with estimates ranging from 25 million to 50 million or more across the Mediterranean world and beyond. The disease struck in waves, returning repeatedly over the following 2 centuries, each recurrence culling populations that had barely begun to recover from the previous outbreak. Some regions lost 70 or 80% of their inhabitants. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned, their streets silent, their buildings crumbling. The classical world, already weakened by centuries of decline, received a blow from which it would never recover. You try to imagine what it must have been like to live through such a catastrophe, then realise you don't need to imagine. The Black Death you survived was the same disease, caused by the same bacterium, producing the same terrible symptoms. The buboes, the fever, the swift progression from health to death. Your ancestors, 800 years before, experienced exactly what your generation experienced. The wheel of plague had simply come around again, finding new populations to devastate, new civilizations to shatter. The bacterium that killed your neighbours was the descendant of bacteria that killed Romans and Byzantines, maintained in rodent populations across the centuries, waiting for conditions that would allow it to sweep through human populations once more. The plague of Justinian did more than kill individuals, it transformed the world. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by demographic collapse, could not maintain its territorial ambitions. The Western Roman provinces that Justinian had reconquered at enormous cost slipped away again, their populations too depleted to defend them. The power vacuum that resulted allowed new peoples and new powers to emerge. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century succeeded partly because the Byzantine and Persian empires had been so weakened by repeated plague outbreaks that they couldn't effectively resist. The medieval world that emerged from the ruins of antiquity was shaped fundamentally by the demographic catastrophe of the 6th century. The economic consequences rippled across centuries. Labour shortages drove up wages and changed the relationship between workers and landowners. Trade networks collapsed as populations died and cities emptied. Agricultural productivity plummeted as fields lay fallow for lack of hands to work them. The elaborate economic systems of the Roman world, the trade routes, the specialised production, the urban manufacturing, gave way to simpler, more localised economies. The transition from ancient to medieval was accelerated by the plague, which destroyed the population base that complex civilizations required. You think about the chroniclers who recorded the Justinian plague, their words preserved across the centuries, their horror still vivid on the page. Procopius, the Byzantine historian, described bodies stacked in towers along the city walls when the cemeteries overflowed. John of Ephesus wrote of ships drifting crewless in the harbour, their sailors dead at their posts. Evagrius Scholasticus, who survived the plague as a child, watched it return again and again throughout his lifetime, killing members of his family in successive outbreaks. These were educated men, literate witnesses whose accounts survived because they wrote them down. But for every chronicler, there were millions of voiceless dead whose experiences were never recorded. The plague's effect on religion and culture was profound. Some turned to deeper faith, convinced that sufficient piety could avert God's wrath. Others abandoned religion, reasoning that no just God would permit such suffering. Apocalyptic expectations intensified as people interpreted the plague as a sign of the end times. The psychological trauma of witnessing mass death on such a scale left marks on collective consciousness that persisted for generations. Art, literature and religious practice all bore the scars of the catastrophe, reflecting a worldview permanently darkened by the experience of near extinction. The connection between the Justinian plague and the Black Death was not understood at the time, but modern science has confirmed what medieval observers could only suspect. The same organism was responsible for both catastrophes. Yersinia pestis, that tiny bacterium carried by fleas on rats, had demonstrated its ability to bring human civilization to its knees. It would demonstrate this ability again and again over the following centuries in outbreaks that killed millions more. The medieval world lived in the shadow of this threat, even when plague was temporarily absent, because everyone knew, or should have known, that it would return. You cough again, your miner's lungs struggling with air that should be easy to breathe, and you contemplate the fragility of human existence. The great empires and civilizations that seem so permanent are actually balanced on knife edges, vulnerable to microscopic organisms and invisible forces. Justinian thought he was rebuilding Rome. Instead, he watched his empire crumble as plague consumed the workers, soldiers, and taxpayers who might have made his dreams reality. Your own world, 7 centuries later, experienced the same humbling, the same demonstration that human ambition means nothing when disease decides to kill. The sun sets on another day of survival, another day of breathing with damaged lungs, another day of wondering how many more remain. The plague of Justinian killed half the world and shaped everything that followed. The Black Death killed a third of Europe and reshaped it just as profoundly. You are a survivor, a statistical anomaly, someone who lived through catastrophes that claimed most of those around you. But survival is not victory. Survival is merely the opportunity to keep struggling, to keep suffering, to keep watching as the world finds new ways to kill those who escaped the old ones. Tomorrow the sun will rise on a world still shaped by ancient plagues, still vulnerable to future ones, still populated by fragile humans who imagine themselves masters of a planet that routinely demonstrates their insignificance. The plague of Justinian haunts your thoughts as you recover from your mining years, but now another traveller's tale captures your imagination. A story about a time even earlier, when the very sky turned against humanity. The year was 536 AD, just 5 years before the Justinian plague would begin its devastation, and something happened that no one could explain. The sun went dark, not an eclipse, which passes in hours, but a dimming that lasted for 18 months, turning day into perpetual twilight and plunging the world into the coldest decade in over 2,000 years. You shiver just hearing about it, even though centuries separate you from that catastrophe. The Byzantine historian Procopius, whom we mentioned before, recorded the phenomenon with bewildered precision. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, he wrote, like the moon during that entire year. Food would not ripen. Crops failed across the entire northern hemisphere. Snow fell in summer. Frost killed what the darkness had weakened. And this was not a local phenomenon, but a global catastrophe, recorded in Chinese chronicles, in Irish annals, in sources from every literate civilization that existed at the time. Something had blocked the sun, and no one knew what it was. Modern science has finally solved the mystery that baffled 6th century observers. Volcanic eruptions, probably multiple eruptions in quick succession, had thrown so much ash and sulphur into the upper atmosphere that sunlight couldn't penetrate to the surface. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve the chemical evidence. Massive spikes in sulfate deposits dating to precisely 536 AD, followed by additional spikes in 540 AD. The first eruption may have occurred in Iceland or North America. The second was almost certainly the catastrophic explosion of Ilopango in El Salvador, one of the largest volcanic events of the past several thousand years. Historians still argue about the relative contributions of the different eruptions and their precise effects on climate, but the general picture is clear. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, enough to devastate agriculture across vast regions. Growing seasons shortened by weeks. Crops that normally thrived couldn't survive the cold. The agricultural surplus that civilizations depended upon simply evaporated, and the famines that followed killed millions. Tree ring evidence from around the world shows stunted growth during this period, a silent testimony to the darkness that fell across the earth. You imagine what it must have been like to wake each morning to a sun that barely pierced the gloom, a pale disk hanging in a sky the colour of ash. The psychological impact would have been immense. Every agricultural society depends on the sun, for warmth, for light, for the photosynthesis that makes food possible. When the sun fails, when the cosmic order seems to have broken down, despair is inevitable. People must have wondered if the world was ending, if God had finally abandoned creation, if the darkness would ever lift. Some surely prayed, some surely raged, some surely simply lay down and waited for death. The cascade of consequences from the volcanic winter of 536 is difficult to fully trace, but impossible to ignore. The famines weakened populations already stressed by climate disruption. The weakened populations proved vulnerable when plague arrived 5 years later. The plague killed so many that it changed the political and economic landscape of the entire Mediterranean world. The fall of the classical order, the rise of medieval Europe, the transformations that shaped your world, all of these were influenced by volcanic eruptions that occurred on the other side of the planet, sending ash into the stratosphere and darkness across the Earth. The climate chaos didn't end with a single event. The 6th century saw repeated cold snaps and agricultural failures, each one pushing fragile populations closer to extinction. The medieval climate optimum that would later allow European population to boom was centuries away. For now, there was only cold, only hunger, only the constant struggle to survive in a world where even the sun seemed hostile. The generation that lived through 536 AD passed their trauma to their children, who passed it to theirs, creating cultural memories of darkness and disaster that echoed through folklore and legend. You think about the relationship between distant volcanic eruptions and local survival, the invisible threads that connect events separated by thousands of miles. A mountain explodes in Central America, and peasants starve in Constantinople. Ash circles the globe on high-altitude winds and civilizations fall. The medieval worldview, which saw everything as connected through divine providence, was not wrong about the interconnection, only about the mechanism. The world is indeed a web, but the threads are atmospheric and geological rather than theological. Pull one strand, and the whole structure trembles. The ice cores tell stories that medieval chroniclers could only dimly perceive. Major volcanic events pepper the record, each one corresponding to periods of climate disruption and human suffering. The eruption of Somalis in 1257 AD produced the largest sulfate spike of the past 7,000 years and may have contributed to the climate deterioration that led to the Great Famine of the 14th century. The Little Ice Age that we discussed earlier was punctuated by volcanic events that deepened and prolonged the cold. Every generation faced the possibility that the sky might darken again, that the sun might fail, that the carefully cultivated fields might freeze before harvest. The volcanic threat continues even now, as you sit contemplating these ancient catastrophes. Somewhere beneath the earth, magma chambers are filling, pressure is building, and eruptions are preparing that will one day darken skies again. The medieval world had no warning systems, no understanding of volcanology, no way to predict or prepare for such events. You simply lived with the knowledge, conscious or not, that the ground beneath your feet might betray you, that the sun above your head might disappear, that forces beyond human control or comprehension could at any moment sweep away everything you knew. The darkness of 536 AD lasted 18 months, and then the sun gradually returned to its normal brightness. But the world that emerged from that darkness was not the world that had entered it. Populations had crashed. Political structures had crumbled. The stage had been set for plague and further catastrophe. The survivors rebuilt as best they could, adapting to new realities, forgetting over generations what the old realities had been. By the time you were born, 536 AD was ancient history, a story told by travellers who had heard it from scholars who had read it in crumbling manuscripts. But the world you inhabit was shaped by that forgotten catastrophe, moulded by volcanic ash and dimmed sunlight into something fundamentally different from what came before. You look up at the sun, bright and warm on this particular afternoon, and you appreciate it with new understanding. That light is not guaranteed. That warmth is not permanent. The sky itself can become an enemy, blocking the very radiation that makes life possible. Medieval people understood vulnerability in ways that modern people have forgotten, understood that survival is provisional, that catastrophe lurks always at the edges, that the cosmic order can break down without warning or explanation. You offer a silent prayer of thanks for the sunlight falling on your face and hope that no distant mountain is preparing to steal it away. The sun shines bright today. The volcanic winters of centuries past nothing but travellers' tales and distant memories. But as you make your way through the streets of your town, you're confronted with a more immediate reality, the inescapable, overwhelming, absolutely suffocating presence of human waste. The smell hits you before you've taken 3 steps from your door. It saturates the air so completely that visitors from the countryside often gag upon entering medieval towns for the first time. You barely notice it anymore. You've been breathing this miasma your entire life, and your nose has long since surrendered to the assault. The filth that surrounds you is so normal, so ubiquitous, that imagining its absence would require more creativity than you possess. The street you walk down is not paved with cobblestones. That luxury is reserved for the wealthiest neighbourhoods, but with packed earth that has been transformed by centuries of accumulated waste into something closer to a latrine than a thoroughfare. Human excrement, animal dung, rotting food scraps, butcher offal, tanner's refuse, dyer's chemicals, and every other form of waste imaginable flows down the centre channel, theoretically heading toward the river but often simply pooling in low spots where it ferments under the sun. You step carefully, aiming for the higher ground along the building edges, but complete avoidance is impossible. By the time you reach the market square, your shoes, if you're fortunate enough to have shoes, are coated with substances you prefer not to identify. The chamber pot system ensures that human waste makes regular aerial appearances in medieval streets. Every household has 1 or more chamber pots, and every morning those pots must be emptied. The official protocol requires a warning shout, "Gardez l'eau," in French, which English speakers would eventually corrupt into "Gardez-l'eau," before flinging the contents into the street below. In practice, the warning is often perfunctory or absent entirely. Being struck by a cascade of waste from an upper window is a common experience, one that victims greet with resignation rather than outrage. What's the point of anger when the alternative, climbing down to street level to dispose of waste properly, is impractical and rarely practiced by anyone? Historians still argue about the precise relationship between medieval sanitation and disease rates, but the general connection is undeniable. The same streets where waste accumulated were the streets where children played, where food was sold, where water was drawn from public fountains or wells. The contamination was total and inescapable. The bacteria that cause dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and countless other intestinal diseases thrived in this environment, passing from waste to water to food to human hosts in an endless cycle. The chronic intestinal complaints we discussed earlier, the perpetual diarrhea that medieval people simply lived with, were direct consequences of sanitation practices that would be criminal in the modern world. The public latrines that exist in some cities are only marginally better than the alternatives. Wooden seats positioned over pits or channels that drain, theoretically, into rivers or cesspools. Dozens of people use the same facilities daily, with no cleaning between uses, no hand-washing facilities, no separation between the waste stream and the drinking water supply. The latrines themselves become breeding grounds for disease, their wooden surfaces absorbing pathogens that transfer to each subsequent user. Using a public latrine might actually be more dangerous than simply finding a quiet alley, which many people do when the latrines are too crowded or too distant or too disgusting even by medieval standards. You pass the butcher's district and the smell intensifies, if such a thing is possible. Blood runs in the gutters, mixing with the other waste streams to create something approaching biological soup. Offal is piled in the streets, awaiting collection by pig farmers who will use it as feed. The same pigs that will eventually be slaughtered and sold in this very market, completing a cycle of contamination that would make a modern epidemiologist weep. The flies are so thick you breathe them in, swatting constantly at the black clouds that swarm around every pile of organic waste. Each fly carries pathogens on its legs and in its gut, depositing them on every surface it touches, including the food you'll purchase for dinner. The tanneries are worse still, concentrated in their own districts, partly because no one can stand to live near them. The process of turning animal hides into leather requires extended soaking in pits of urine and feces, the ammonia and enzymes softening the material for working. The stench is apocalyptic, a physical presence that seems to coat your skin and hair and lungs with its essence. Workers in tanneries develop distinctive pallors and chronic illnesses, their constant exposure to waste and chemicals destroying their health incrementally. The runoff from these operations flows into the same waterways that supply drinking water downstream, carrying its toxic burden to populations who have no idea where their water has been. The dyers add their own contributions to the toxic stew. Chemical mordants fix colours to fabric, and those chemicals, which include arsenic, lead, and various acids, wash into the water supply along with everything else. The river that flows through your town runs different colours depending on which dye house is operating upstream, and none of those colours is the clear, clean flow that nature intended. Fish have long since abandoned this stretch of water. Anyone desperate enough to drink directly from the river risks poisoning alongside the usual intestinal infections. But people do drink from it, because the wells are contaminated too, and the alternatives are limited to beer and wine that not everyone can afford. You finally reach the market square, where the density of waste somehow increases even further. Vendors have been selling here since dawn, and their refuse accumulates in drifts around the stalls. Vegetable scraps, meat trimmings, fish guts, spoiled goods of every description. All of it piles up throughout the day, drawing rats and flies and feral dogs that scavenge freely among the shoppers. The food you're here to purchase sits on tables mere inches from the waste, unprotected by wrapping or cases, exposed to every contaminating influence the environment can offer. You haggle over bread that has been touched by a dozen hands since it left the oven, cheese that has been sitting in open air absorbing whatever pathogens drift past, meat that may or may not have come from a healthy animal, and has certainly not been refrigerated. The wealthy can afford some protection from the worst of medieval sanitation. Private garderobes built into castle walls, dropping waste into moats or rivers, or at least away from living quarters. Servants who empty chamber pots and clean living spaces. Houses positioned upwind and uphill from the worst industrial polluters. But even the wealthy cannot escape the fundamental reality of a world without germ theory, without sewage treatment, without the basic infrastructure that modern people take for granted. The king himself lives surrounded by waste that would be unacceptable in a modern slum. The differences between rich and poor are matters of degree rather than kind. You complete your purchases and begin the long walk home, navigating the familiar obstacle course of waste and puddles and suspicious substances. A chamber pot empties from a window ahead of you, and you dodge the cascade with practiced reflexes. A dead dog lies in the gutter, bloating in the sun, adding its decomposition to the general atmosphere. A child squats openly in an alley, contributing to tomorrow's contamination. This is simply life. This is simply how humans live. The idea that it could be different, that streets could be clean, and water could be pure and waste could be managed rather than simply dumped. These are concepts that won't fully develop for centuries yet. You arrive home and prepare your purchased food in a space that is marginally cleaner than the streets outside, though contaminated in its own ways by the animals you share it with and the waste that accumulates between infrequent cleanings. Your meal will contain pathogens from a dozen sources, some of which will make you mildly ill, and some of which might kill you if your immune system weren't already adapted to this constant assault. You eat anyway, because eating is necessary and alternatives don't exist, and you try not to think too hard about what you're actually consuming. Tomorrow you'll walk the same streets, breathe the same air, drink the same water, and the cycle will continue as it has continued for generations. A slow-motion catastrophe so normalised that no one even recognises it as a catastrophe anymore. You trudge home through the filth, your purchases tucked under your arm, your mind wandering to the strange tales you've been collecting throughout your long and improbable life. The plagues, the famines, the fires, the wars. You've survived them all somehow, against every reasonable expectation. But now you remember something odd. Something that's been nagging at the back of your mind ever since a travelling friar mentioned it weeks ago. During the Black Death, he said, people slaughtered cats, thousands upon thousands of cats, killed as witches' familiars, as agents of Satan, as demonic creatures spreading the plague through their very presence. You think of the cats you've known, the mousers that kept grain stores safe, the hunters that prowled barns and cottages keeping vermin at bay, and you begin to understand with a creeping horror that medieval people may have killed the one creature that could have saved them. The association between cats and witchcraft had been building for centuries before the Black Death arrived. Pope Gregory IX's papal bull of 1233, Vox in Rama, described heretical rituals supposedly involving the worship of black cats, cementing the connection between felines and diabolical practice. As witch hysteria grew throughout the medieval period, cats, particularly black cats, became increasingly suspect. Women accused of witchcraft were often said to have cat familiars, demonic spirits in animal form that assisted in their malevolent magic. The logical extension was that cats themselves might be agents of evil, regardless of their apparent usefulness in controlling vermin. When the plague arrived and people desperately sought explanations, cats fell under renewed suspicion. Their nocturnal habits, their glowing eyes in darkness, their perceived aloofness and mystery, all of these qualities that had once been merely unusual now seemed potentially sinister. Cats were seen wandering among the dead. Cats lurked in the shadows where disease seemed to breed. Cats were associated with the old women who were often accused of causing the plague through witchcraft. The syllogism was flawed but compelling. Witches caused the plague, witches kept cats. Therefore cats must be connected to the plague. Historians still argue about the scale of cat persecution during the medieval period, and whether it significantly affected cat populations across Europe. Some scholars suggest that the killings were localised rather than universal, concentrated in areas where witch hysteria ran particularly high. Others argue that the cultural association between cats and evil was so pervasive that cats faced persecution everywhere, reducing their numbers to a fraction of what healthy populations would have been. The truth likely varied by region and time period, but the overall effect was clear. At precisely the moment when rat populations were exploding and spreading plague-bearing fleas, their primary predator was being systematically eliminated. You think about the mathematics of this catastrophe. Cats are extraordinarily efficient rat killers. A single cat can kill dozens of rats per month, and more importantly, the mere presence of cats in an area suppresses rat populations by creating a climate of fear that prevents rats from foraging freely. Remove the cats, and the rats multiply unchecked. The rats carry fleas, the fleas carry plague. The chain of causation is invisible to medieval observers, but it's no less deadly for being invisible. Every cat killed in a paroxysm of superstitious fear meant more rats, more fleas, more plague, more death. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. People killed cats because they believed cats were spreading the plague. In reality, cats were one of the few defences against the actual plague vectors. The superstition that prompted the killing wasn't just wrong. It was lethally, catastrophically, species-threateningly wrong. It was as if drowning victims, believing that water was their friend, had systematically destroyed every flotation device available. The medieval mind, operating without germ theory, without understanding of disease transmission, without any accurate model of what was actually happening, reached conclusions that made the disaster immeasurably worse. You remember the cats of your own childhood, the sleek hunters that prowled the edges of every farm and cottage. Your grandmother kept cats and was never accused of witchcraft, though she was fortunate to live in an area where such accusations were less common. Her cats kept the grain stores relatively free of rats, and perhaps, you now realise, kept your family relatively free of plague. The homes without cats, the homes where superstitious residents had killed or driven away the mousers, were the homes where rats nested freely in the walls and fleas bred in the bedding and disease found easy entry. The The correlation was there for anyone to see, but nobody was looking for it. The persecution of cats was part of a larger pattern of medieval thinking that consistently made disease worse, the flagellants spreading plague through their processions, the doctors applying contaminated bandages and bleeding already weakened patients, the authorities crowding populations into cities where disease could spread freely, the religious leaders blaming sin rather than sanitation. At every turn, the medieval response to epidemic disease was shaped by beliefs that had no connection to biological reality and often actively worsened outcomes. The cat killing was simply the most poetically tragic example, murdering your protectors while embracing your destroyers. Some cats survived, of course. The species wasn't exterminated, and in many areas cats continued to be valued for their practical utility, regardless of their supposed demonic associations. Barn cats in particular were often too useful to kill, their rat-catching abilities too valuable to sacrifice to theological concerns. But the overall cat population was suppressed, and in the most superstitious regions cats became rare enough that rats faced essentially no predation at all. These were often the regions where plague hit hardest and lingered longest, though medieval observers attributed this to the sinfulness of the population, rather than the absence of their feline guardians. You watch a cat stalking through the shadows at the edge of your property, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. It's hunting rats, as cats do, performing the ancient service that its species has provided to humans since the first granaries attracted the first rodents. You feel a surge of gratitude for this creature, this small predator that asks nothing from you, except tolerance, and perhaps the occasional scrap of food. The friar who told you about the cat killing seemed disturbed by the tale, and now you understand why. "We killed them," he said, shaking his head. "We killed our best defense because we thought they were the enemy." The devil must have laughed. The superstition persists even now, though the worst of the killings have passed. Black cats are still considered unlucky in many regions. Cats are still associated with witches and dark magic. The cultural legacy of medieval fear lingers in folklore and folk belief, shaping attitudes toward animals that are, in biological reality, humanity's oldest and most effective partners in rodent control. Every black cat that crosses your path carries the weight of centuries of persecution, the genetic legacy of ancestors who survived the killings, the living reminder of a catastrophe born from ignorance and fear. You leave a scrap of meat on the doorstep for the hunting cat, a small offering of thanks for services that most people don't even recognize. The cat pauses, sniffs, accepts the gift with the dignity that cats bring to all transactions with humans. Then it melts back into the shadows, resuming its patrol, killing the rats that would otherwise breed in your walls and fill your home with fleas. Somewhere in those shadows, the eternal war between cat and rodent continues, a war that humans once tried to end by eliminating the wrong side. You shake your head at the folly of your ancestors and hope that future generations will find your own beliefs equally misguided. They probably will. The capacity for catastrophic error seems to be a permanent feature of human consciousness, as durable as the plague itself. The cat disappears into the gathering dusk, and you stand for a moment at your doorway, contemplating the improbable journey that has brought you to this point. You have lived through things that should have killed you, plagues that claimed your neighbours, famines that starved your community, fires that consumed your home, wars that devastated your countryside, diseases that rotted you from within. You have breathed toxic air, drunk poisoned water, eaten contaminated food, and submitted to medical treatments that nearly finished what illness had started. You have watched children march to their doom and neighbours burn for their beliefs. You have descended into mines that destroyed your lungs and emerged to find the world still intent on your destruction. And yet here you stand, alive, improbably and inexplicably alive, a survivor in a world that seems designed to produce nothing but corpses. How did humanity make it through? The question has been haunting you throughout this long night of remembrance, and you still don't have a satisfying answer. The medieval world threw everything it had at the human species, biological, environmental, social, self-inflicted, and somehow enough people survived to continue the story. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe, but half of Europe survived. The Great Famine starved millions, but millions more found enough food to keep breathing. The fires burned and the wars raged and the persecution slaughtered the innocent, and still the population crept back, generation after generation, refusing to go extinct despite every opportunity. Part of the answer lies in simple mathematics. Human populations are resilient because humans reproduce faster than catastrophes can kill them, at least in the long run. A plague that kills half the population in a year is devastating, but the survivors can replenish those numbers within a few generations if conditions allow. The medieval world never experienced a catastrophe severe enough to push the species below the threshold of viable reproduction. Every disaster, no matter how terrible, left enough survivors to start again. The margin was often terrifyingly thin. Some communities did go extinct, some bloodlines did end, some regions did become permanently depopulated, but the species as a whole always pulled through. Part of the answer lies in adaptation. The survivors of each catastrophe were, almost by definition, the ones best suited to survive that particular catastrophe. Plague survivors may have carried genetic resistance that they passed to their descendants. Famine survivors may have had metabolisms that could endure longer on less. The constant pressure of death shaped human populations over generations, selecting for traits that enhanced survival under medieval conditions. You are the descendant of the lucky and the strong, the inheritor of genetic gifts earned through the suffering of countless ancestors who lived just long enough to reproduce before dying. Historians still argue about whether medieval people understood their own mortality in ways that modern people have forgotten. Some scholars suggest that the constant presence of death produced a kind of psychological resilience, an acceptance of mortality that allowed people to function despite omnipresent danger. Others argue that medieval people were just as traumatized by death as modern people would be, but lacked the vocabulary or the social permission to express their trauma openly. The truth is probably somewhere between. Death was normal, but normal doesn't mean easy. Every parent who buried a child, every spouse who watched their partner succumb to plague, every survivor who emerged from catastrophe into a world emptied of everyone they loved, all of them suffered, even if their suffering left fewer records than their deaths. You think about your own survival and find no simple explanation. You weren't stronger than the neighbours who died. You weren't smarter or more virtuous or more beloved by God. You were simply lucky, present in the right places at the right times, absent from the wrong places at the wrong times, blessed by 1,000 small accidents that could easily have gone the other way. The flea that bit your neighbour instead of you. The ship that carried plague to the next port instead of yours. The fire that stopped one house short of your door. Survival in the medieval world was a lottery, and you happened to hold winning tickets. So far. The future remains as uncertain as ever. The plagues will return, they always do, cycling through populations with grim regularity. The famines will come again when the harvests fail. The wars will continue their endless grinding destruction. The mines will keep consuming workers. The childbirth beds will keep claiming mothers. The water will keep poisoning everyone who drinks it. You have survived the past, but the past offers no guarantees about the future. Tomorrow could bring the catastrophe that finally claims you. Every tomorrow could. This is simply the condition of human existence, the baseline reality that medieval people understood in their bones even when they couldn't articulate it in their words. But tonight, in this moment, you are alive. The fire crackles in the hearth, its warmth pushing back the darkness that presses against your walls. Your family sleeps nearby, their breathing soft and regular, their bodies intact, their futures uncertain but not yet foreclosed. The cat you fed is out there somewhere, hunting the rats that would otherwise hunt you, performing its ancient service in the ancient shadows. The world is vast and dangerous and full of things that want to kill you, but right now, right here, in this small circle of light and warmth, you are safe, you are present, you are among the living. The medieval world was brutal in ways that modern people can barely imagine, but it was also human in ways that modern people sometimes forget. People loved each other fiercely, knowing that love could be snatched away at any moment. They built and created and dreamed, knowing that everything they built could burn, everything they created could be destroyed, every dream could end in nightmare. They found joy where they could, in festivals and feasts, in songs and stories, in the simple pleasures of a full belly and a warm bed and the company of those they loved. The shadow of death made these joys more precious, not less. The medieval world was dark, but it was also full of light, the light that humans create whenever they refuse to surrender to despair. You're tired now. Tired in your bones. Tired from a lifetime of survival that has taken everything you had to give. The fire is burning low, its flames subsiding into glowing embers that pulse like a sleeping heart. Your eyelids grow heavy, and the memories of all you've witnessed begin to blur and fade, retreating into the mist that gathers at the edges of consciousness. The world outside your walls is still dangerous, still deadly, still filled with plagues and famines and fires and wars. But inside these walls, for this moment, there is peace. You let your eyes close, and the darkness is no longer frightening. It's soft and warm and welcoming, a blanket wrapping around your weary body, easing the aches that years of survival have accumulated. The sounds of the night, the wind in the thatch, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustle of the cat returning from its hunt, become a lullaby, ancient and familiar, the same sounds that humans have heard since the first nights of the first people. You're part of something vast and old, a chain of survivors stretching back to the beginning of the species and forward to a future you'll never see. Your link in that chain was forged in suffering and tempered by catastrophe, but it holds. It holds. Sleep comes gently now, not the sleep of exhaustion or illness, but the sleep of earned rest, of a day completed, of a life, however improbably, still continuing. The medieval world fades around you, its horrors becoming distant, its dangers losing their power to frighten. You drift in a warmth that has nothing to do with fires or sunlight, a comfort that comes from within, from the simple miracle of being alive when so many are not. The last thing you feel before sleep claims you completely as gratitude. Gratitude for the breath in your lungs, the blood in your veins, the stubborn persistence of life in a universe that seems determined to end it. The night deepens, the stars wheel overhead, indifferent and eternal. The world keeps turning, carrying its cargo of the living and the dead, the survivors and the lost, the remembered and the forgotten. And you, small and fragile and improbable, sleep on, dreaming perhaps of the morning that will come, as mornings always do, bringing with it new chances and new dangers, new joys and new sorrows, the endless adventure of being human in a world that never promised anyone tomorrow. But tomorrow comes anyway. It always has. And somehow, against all odds, it always will. Sleep now, you've earned it. Let the darkness hold you gently. Let the silence wrap you in its embrace. Let go of the fears and the memories and the weight of all you've carried. Tomorrow the sun will rise and the world will continue its ancient dance of creation and destruction, of life and death, of endings and beginnings. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, there is only rest. Tonight, there is only peace. Tonight, you are safe and warm and alive, and nothing else matters. Sweet dreams, survivor. Sweet dreams.